11 miles. "How's your relationship with the Harrison boy going?" asked Sarah's mother. They were sitting in the front room of their enormous house, sipping herbal tea that had long since gone cold. "You know, I think I like him," Sarah said to her mother. "The others loved me, I knew. But they were arrogant, too confident in themselves. They believed they were the apple of my eye. They weren't aware that I was the one whom they depended on. But this one, he's different. He knows his place in this relationship. He would do anything for me. I can tell." "Would he endure the path for you? It's not an easy road. Many eligible bachelors have trod down that road and been distracted by the terror or pain." "Should I make him go through that?" Sarah told her. "So many men we've sacrificed to that road. I'm beginning to feel like I'll never find a man who can withstand it." "You should. I remember when I tested your father. He clung to me like an oyster for weeks afterward." Sarah's mother cackled and rested her blind eyes on Sarah. "If you test him, you must remember every step. If you forget to tell him even one rule, you'll never see him again." "Yes, I know, Mother," replied Sarah. "How are you planning to get him on the path?" asked Sarah's mother. "I think I'll invite him to meet you. He hasn't met you or Dad yet, then I'll give him directions to our house in the cold from there." "Are you going to do it over Christmas? It'd be far less suspicious if you did it at a time when it's difficult for families to be together." "I like that idea," said Sarah. "Tell me what happens at the entrance of the path again. I always forget." "You must tell him that the street doesn't have a road sign, but also tell him there will be rose petals floating near the entrance, and that the path will be on the right side of the road." "All right then, let me get a paper. I'll write down the rules and double-check them to make sure it's absolutely right." "We wouldn't want him to die on the road and join the cold like all the other men." "No, I intend to keep this one as close to me as possible, so I'll be extra careful with the directions this time." Michael was elated. On their last date, Sarah had told him that his parents wanted to meet him and promised to mail him directions to their house. The directions had come a bit later than he'd expected, and he'd only just gotten them hours before he was leaving. She told him it took about 2 hours to get there, so he left 3 hours before dinner to be early and try to impress them. He checked his breath, picked a few extra sticks of gum, and then was off. He checked the directions, and the first page was basically normal. He read through them and noted that they were most likely taking him toward the forest that only a few people really lived in, but he wasn't one to judge Sarah's parents' taste in real estate. The radio he listened to was a news report about someone from a few counties over going missing. Alan Brecker, a 37-year-old man from Mason County, was reported missing 2 days ago when he didn't come back from a trip in Pierce County National Reserve. Authorities are calling it a baffling case. "We looked on satellite images and couldn't even see his car." That was the voice of Pierce County Sheriff. "But when we changed it to thermal imaging, we saw a deathly cold strip about 10 miles long curving into the forest, and all the space around it was still 50 degrees. If you have any information regarding the whereabouts of Alan, please contact the proper authorities." In other news, it hadn't snowed that year, so the forest was unusually warm at night for December, but that cold strip was weird. It couldn't snow in only a line no thicker than an SUV, so why was it so cold? Michael, being a meteorology undergrad, could not think of an explanation. The ride to the forest was very uneventful. He listened to a radio talk show until he lost focus and only heard mindless babble, so he turned it off and sat in silence for 30 minutes or so before he turned onto the road that passed through the woods. He looked down at the directions and saw the final one on the page. "The road you need to turn down does not have a road sign, but there should be rose petals blowing around near the entrance of the road." That was unusual, thought Michael. He was just going to have to drive around until he found rose petals. It was dark by now, and Michael switched on his high beams. The road in front of him was dark, and he looked at his watch and car clock, which he had synced. It was 6:23. The sun had gone down by now, and the air was cooling fast. He had 37 minutes until he had to be there, and he was making good time. He drove for 5 more minutes, letting the wind blow through his hair through the open window of his Honda. He looked out at the direction and flipped the page over and laughed a little while he glanced at the first thing on the page. Roll up your window and turn off the radio. What? Why would that be necessary? Maybe Sarah's parents disliked anything that looked non-sophisticated. But Michael did it anyway, figuring Sarah knew her parents pretty well to know precisely the method they prefer her boyfriend to arrive. Sarah. Michael's thoughts drifted to her to fill up the silence. Everything about her was perfect. Michael loved her laugh and tried to draw it out whenever possible. He loved her seriousness because it was fun to shatter. He loved her intelligence as she was clearly smarter than he was, and he didn't mind her body either. Michael was snapped out of his imagination when he saw a pink petal lying on the road in his high beams, and another one floating through the air as gracefully as Sarah herself. This petal, for whatever reason, seemed to stir something inside of him. And then he suddenly felt a huge burst of love for Sarah, such as he'd never experienced before. He felt as if he wanted to curl up and die so that Sarah wouldn't get her shoes dirty as she walked over the street. Rose petals blew through the air like snowflakes now. Michael almost missed the turn, but he stopped himself as soon as he saw the abrupt direction change. The road was dark and twisted, so Michael had very limited vision of what was down the bend. He checked his mileage out of habit. 13,000. Michael was surprised it was exactly on 13,000. But that was soon to change from the drive back to his house. He checked his directions. Remain at 30 miles an hour on the road unless you feel you must drive faster. This one at least made sense, thought Michael. He remembered his dad telling him on his first date back in high school that parents like people who don't speed, but who arrive a bit early anyway. But why would he feel that he must drive faster? Why use the word must? It made the sentence sound like a life or death situation. He checked the rules again. I suggest turning on your heating system. You won't want to take your eyes off the road later. Also, look up at the stars. They're gorgeous. Michael took her word for it. He ducked forward and looked up out of his windshield. He'd immediately forgot all about the heating suggestion, as the sky was so clear you could see more than stars. You could see dust clouds, nebulas, asteroid belts, along with hundreds of tiny pinpricks of light. There were so many of them, he doubted if all the stars ancestors had seen put together could even hold a candle to the sheer number of white lights he saw glittering in the sky. His awe was short-lived, however, as he heard a crunching sound and realized he'd missed a turn and was half off the road. He pulled his car back in reverse, feeling very satisfied with himself, and continued along the road. He checked his mileage again. 13,001. He traveled 1 mile down the dark road. Keep focused on the road. It gets less like a road and more like a forest from here. You don't want a wrecked car. Michael was wondering why these directions weren't exactly like normal directions. It seemed more like a survival guide than a map. Michael checked his mileage again. 13,003. At 3 miles, Mike was starting to get wary of something. He sensed something sinister lurking in the trees, watching him closely but keeping just out of sight. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he stared more intently into the forest. The trees passed by him, not revealing what was watching him, but as he passed in the corner of his eye, he saw a man. Michael gave a small yell and slowed his car to a halt. He opened his door and immediately felt a frozen air, his breath now visible, and he could feel tiny pinpricks on his skin. Michael walked back 10 feet or so to where he had seen the man and looked through the copse of trees. The journey was illuminated by the brilliant stars and somewhat brilliant moon. He looked to the copse where the man was supposed to be, but the man was gone. He'd vanished. He checked the forest behind him and saw the man, slightly hunched over, standing completely motionless. He was barely visible because he was on the side of the road without any moonlight, but Michael called out to him.
"Hello?"
he cried. The figure adjusted its head so the limited light reflected off his eyes, creating 2 glowing pinpricks in the darkness.
"Hello?"
Michael cried out again. The cold was becoming almost unbearable. The figure started moving toward him, slowly at first, his footsteps making soft crunching sounds on the carpet of dead leaves. But then the man started picking up speed. Michael was becoming very frightened at this point and started to tense his muscles and his legs. The man showed no sign of slowing. He was jogging at Michael at this point, and Michael decided he shouldn't stay here with this maniac any longer. Michael ran toward his Honda, opening the door and pressing on the gas, all while looking behind him. He didn't see the man on the road. Had he given up, or was he still following the car? Michael turned his gaze back toward the road and gave a terrified yell. Standing in the middle of the road, right in the way of his high beams, was a man made of black smoke. His skin writhed and moved like smoke, but it stayed in thick twisting bands that wrapped themselves into the shape of a man. Michael slammed on his brakes, but he was too close. He ran into the man and the smoke passed over his car and out of sight. Michael halted in the middle of the road and checked his rearview mirrors. He saw no corpses lying strewn by on the road, no blood, no sign that the figure had even been there, but when he looked out of his driver's side window, his blood turned to ice. There were 4 smoke men, moving toward him slowly, tiptoeing over the twigs and dead leaves that littered the forest floor, moving slowly, deliberately. Out of the passenger side, he could see one nearly gripping the handle for his door. Michael decided to break the 30-mile-per-hour rule. He sped down the path, which now turned to dirt at 50 miles an hour, slowing only to turn. He checked his watch and his car clock. That's unusual, he thought. Not a minute had passed. It was like time had frozen from the intense cold. Michael realized now he was freezing. He was fogging up the windows and his breath was freezing in sheets of ice. Michael turned the heat on like Sarah's instructions had told him to. He looked at the directions on the next step and was very frightened. Don't listen to the whispers. Whispers? What whispers? Did the smoke men make them? How is he supposed to drown them out? But Michael obeyed because Sarah told him to. Sarah, how she glowed like a firefly, her body teaching the stars themselves how to shine. Michael wanted so desperately to impress her parents, to make them see how happy she would be if she married him. Michael admitted he was thinking about it. He already had $200 in a section of his budget to buy a ring, but he hadn't told her. Now, should he go with a traditional proposal or do something big? This is what he thought about, even as tiny voices began to converse in the back of his head, not loud enough to be understood, but loud enough to be heard. Every time he got curious, he would force his thoughts back to marrying Sarah. The whispers abruptly stopped as soon as the mileage counter clicked over to 13,005. Michael looked back at the directions page. Don't look at the moon. Whatever you see, keep your eyes forward. The moon. Michael could only see the halo of the moon over the trees. What was so dangerous about it? Michael continued driving at 25 miles an hour, thinking about Sarah and what horrors this moon was about to present him with. He was gripping his steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. The smoke men still lurking in his mind, trying to get inside of his car. He could see a few of them very distantly in the forest, and he decided to speed up a little. On the left side of him, the forest suddenly opened up to a huge lake. The water was still and glassy, and lit up like a torch because of the massive moon. It was 10 times bigger than it was normally, and Michael suddenly had the impression that he was closer to it than he normally was, somewhere between the earth and the moon. But Sarah's smooth voice entered his mind. Don't look at the moon. Michael forced his eyes away and gasped. He was about to tumble into the lake. The turn was so sudden that anyone who was looking at the moon would have fallen in. Michael slammed on his brakes and twisted the steering wheel. He felt his tires slide under him as he turned sideways and drifted toward the steep drop-off. But he could feel his wheels slowing down and friction working to his advantage. He stopped mere inches from the water, which undoubtedly was only warm enough to just barely be liquid. Unless it wasn't water. Michael began to slowly move forward again. He decided to save energy and turn off his headlights. The light of the moon was so bright it was all he needed. He began his drive in the very center of the road and saw the end of the light. The trees ahead grew so thick it was pitch black. Michael approached this imposing archway of darkness and switched the headlights back on. He entered the darkness warily, expecting an army of the smoke men to attack him. His headlights started flickering. They snapped and popped, but stayed on as adamantly as rocks in the sea, refusing the waves permission to break them. He could see smoky gray figures sprinting through the darkness and only barely being visible as the lights came back on. He checked his rearview mirror and saw many smoke men running toward the woods, trying to get away from something. All of them running across the road and into the forest on the other side. Suddenly there weren't many more of them. All of them had run and hid in the thick trees. Michael saw his radio flicker on. There were soft pops and hisses, no normal stations. The digital readout didn't actually have a channel number. It was an empty station. The quiet was shattered by a scream so loud it caused the car to shake. Michael became suddenly and painfully aware that he didn't like loud sounds. He was so startled he swerved off the road and hit a tree. It wasn't a bad collision. The car was only dented. The scream stopped and then emanated a voice. The voice was warped and breathy, the voice of a man, but it was deep and wet and slow. I've seen your mind, Michael. I know your thoughts. I've also seen hers, Sarah's mind. Michael didn't want anything besides himself touching Sarah, and he felt a hot rage fall over him. Do you ever think that maybe she doesn't love you? Maybe she's using you for her own purpose. What if she says no when you finally scratch up enough money to buy her that ring? It's not impossible. Isn't that what happened last time? With Julia? Michael's heart stopped. How did the man in the radio know about Julia? Julia ended their relationship a year and a half ago. He discovered her in his bedroom with another man, and she stole $2,000 out of his bank account. But I hear you really love Sarah. I hear you'll do anything for her, so let's make a deal. I'll slip $100,000 into her purse, and all you have to do is turn around and go back. Michael decided this thing must be able to hear him, so he responded. No. I'll take it up to $200,000, said the thing in the radio. No. I'll make her the sole heiress to a massive fortune. She'll be practically dripping money out of her porcelain skin. She'll be wearing dozens of pearls, diamonds, and rubies. Perhaps that'll be all she's wearing. And all of that happens if you just turn around and go back onto the interstate. No. Sarah wants me to come to her house, and that's what I'll do. There was a pause here. Clearly, this thing was thinking. Do you know who I am? Do you know what I can do to you? Do you know what I can do to you, to her? I could have her killed. I could get her beaten so harshly her exquisite features are permanently altered, her face covered in scars and malformed. I could puncture your gas tank. I could strangle you. Turn around. Michael broke the 30 miles per hour rule again. While he sped down the road, rounding curves and switchbacks, the voice on the radio was screaming. It screamed 1,000 different voices. 1 minute it was a man, and then a woman, and then a child. Then it was a pig squealing, a goat screaming, and underlying all of this was cracks and pops of breaking bones, squishes of flesh being torn, and thuds of vicious beating. And the radio turned off. Michael checked the instructions again. Don't listen to the voice on the radio. Don't look behind you. Michael became stiff. The instruction booklet fell to the floor. Why couldn't he look behind him? What was back there? Was it the man in the radio? Michael heard a soft sound in his ear. It was a whispering. Not loud enough to be understood, but just loud enough to be audible. It was the whispering from before. Sarah had warned him not to listen to it. He tried to shut his ears to the sound, but couldn't help taking a quick glance in his rearview mirror. He almost passed out from shock. There, sitting directly behind him, was a smoke man. It stared longingly out the window. As soon as Michael saw it, it snapped its faceless head toward him. Michael quickly looked away, wondering if the thing had seen him. He drove in silence for what seemed like forever. He was moving very slowly so as to not startle the smoke man in the back seat. He heard the smoke man shift in his seat from time to time, and the temperature seemed to drop even lower now that it was inside the car. And then a noise shattered the silence. It was so unexpected, Michael jumped in his seat, accidentally making the car swerve a bit, but righting himself. The sound was his window rolling down. The temperature seemed to drop by 20 degrees in his car as the air outside poured into it, and Michael dared to peek into his rearview mirror. The smoke man had left. Michael rolled up the window and pulled up his direction booklet. Slow down. You'll hear the smoke men screaming. Don't focus on it. Michael looked ahead at the road. It was very twisted now, even starting to tilt at the side in some places, and on either side of the road was a steep cliff. Michael slowed to a crawl, and he started to drive down the treacherous roadway. He heard the scream of a man, a loud yell, and then another, but all the screams were distinctly male. Some said old words, some spoke different languages, and some were laughing maniacally. It was these that disturbed him the most. They were laughing at the misery all around him. Slap. Michael jumped and saw a smoky hand on the window. Slap. Another one on his rear view. Slap. Right in front of his face on the windshield. Crack. The back window split, but it didn't entirely break. Slap. Michael broke the 30 miles an hour rule for the third time. As he accelerated, the road became less curved, and the trees returned rather than the cliffs. The smoke men continued to barrage his car, but he was beating them in speed, so most of it was only the back. They started to fall behind, and then they were far behind. They couldn't catch up with him, and he lost sight of them around a bend. The car started making grinding noises and slowing down. The headlights flickered and then went out, which cast the road in an eerie blackness. No light penetrated the thick trees, and Michael was alone in the dark in a car that didn't work. He checked the instructions. Close your eyes. Keep your eyes closed and restart the car. Michael looked up and saw small amounts of motion in the darkness. It was difficult to see, but it was definitely there. Something gray was seething out there. It was swirling and billowing. It looked like smoke. They had surrounded him. There were hundreds of them, slowly moving closer, compressing him in. Michael shut his eyes tight and fumbled for the key. He felt the hood of the car dip slightly as if there was a weight on it. And he found the keys. He twisted them hard and pressed the gas. There was 100 screams as he barreled through the road, and he opened his eyes to see the smokeman retreating from the headlights as he barreled down the road. He slowed at the curve, then tore down the strip again, hearing the smokeman slapping his back windows to try and get in. Crack! His rear window now split like a broken rib, but Michael kept driving. He could see a smokeman hanging desperately onto his spoiler, punching his window, but his companions grabbed at him, trying to get closer to the car, and pulled him down. But suddenly they stopped hitting the car and pulled back. It was like they'd given up, or that they were waiting for something bigger and meaner to get him, because they couldn't. Michael slowed down, and they slowed down. He stopped, and they remained still. He sped up, they sped up. They kept a constant 20 feet from the car, watching Michael. Michael checked his mileage. 13,010. He looked up and saw that the figures had moved. They were now lining the path. On both sides of the road, they watched him. He checked his instructions. I know they're watching you, but just keep driving. They won't hurt you. Michael followed his instructions without complaint, but looked at the watch and car clock. 6:23. Not a minute had passed since he turned into that godforsaken road, and this had felt like hours. Maybe his clocks were broken. But what are the chances they both break at precisely 6:23? The figures continued watching him, but he focused on the road. The trees here were high and straight, but the smokemen seemed to be imitating that. They appeared like they were attempting to stand at military-like attention, but sometimes got antsy and started moving their arms in a happy, almost excited way. Michael glanced at his mileage. 13,011. The car gave a lurch and shut off. It started to move on its own accord. Michael kept slamming on his brakes, but they were useless as the car was off. The Honda seemed determined to finish, even when its engine was off. It increased its speed, hurtling down a straight strip of road. Michael began to see a red light ahead and scrambled for the instructions. His frozen fingers hurt when they moved. He managed to pick up the instruction and look down the list. It was the last one on the page, and there was a single tear stain that ran down the page and rolled off. She was crying when she wrote this.
Shut your eyes, please.
He looked at the red light and closed his eyes. The cold air was starting to heat up. His fingers were rejoicing at the sudden warmth. Through his eyelids, he could see a soft red light. It was getting scorching hot. His seatbelt was burning him. The leather seats were becoming wet with perspiration, and Michael started to scream. It was the worst pain he'd ever experienced. All of his nerves were on overdrive. He was shaking, convulsing, and crying from the pain. He lost all consciousness thought, but what he knew he had to do, but couldn't remember why. He clamped his hands over his eyes. He had a curious sensation of his face shifting and moving, and he realized the flesh was melting off of his body. The feeling started everywhere. All his skin was falling off him, and he heard a voice in his head. It was the same voice, the voice from the radio. I told you to turn around. I told you I'd bathe Sarah in riches if you did, but now you're burning. How does that feel? I could pick the flesh off your body, off the ground, and make you eat it because you didn't follow a simple instruction. But I'm merciful. I will allow you to survive if only you open your eyes and look at me. Michael could not speak. The pain was too intense, but an image came into his mind. The image was Sarah. And Sarah was smiling. This brief picture of her was all he needed. He knew that this monster was a liar. He wouldn't give Sarah so much as a dime. But this pain would kill him, that much he knew. And he accepted death. Tears streamed down his bloody and blistered face as he lay down to die. You surely will die if you do not allow me to save you, it said. But its voice was different now. It was harsher, more gravelly, and deepening, becoming more of a growl than a voice. No, Michael croaked out a weak reply. You chose to sacrifice yourself for nothing, die and lose the chance to be with Sarah. I won't die. You won't speak the truth. Michael's voice cracked and his throat exploded with pain. He felt a wet sensation flowing down his neck, but it didn't feel like his neck anymore. It felt like a mass of ruined strings, snapping like ropes being burned. Open your eyes, yelled the monster. Michael felt a hand grip his neck and squeeze. Another hand grabbed his hands that were covering his eyes and pulled, but Michael resisted. He kept his hands on his face until the monster's strength began to lift them off. A red light pierced his eyelids even with them shut tight. But with a deep demonic yell, the pain vanished. The man in the radio spoke no more, and the red light was replaced with a peaceful, deep blue-black. Perhaps he had died. Perhaps he was saved. But that was too good to imagine. He simply relaxed in the blissful silence. The air was cold again, but not as cold as it had been. It was a bit cooler than room temperature. Then a sound broke the silence. It was a faint sound. The sound of footsteps on gravel. They were faster footsteps. The owner of the feet were jogging. The sound was getting closer. Michael pressed his hands harder against his eyelids, tears sliding down his cheeks. He wanted to die. He didn't want any more pain, no more driving, no more smoke men, no more living. He heard the door of his car open, and he knew what would happen. A smoke man would do it. But the smoke man didn't smell like smoke. It smelled like perfume. And the lips that pressed against his didn't feel like smoke. But no, it couldn't be Sarah. It had to be a trick. It was the man in the radio pretending to be her, or using her corpse to try and get him to open his eyes. Michael, you can open your eyes now. said Sarah's silken smooth voice.
"No," he croaked out. "This is a trick. It's not you. I won't open them."
"My parents won't be very pleased if you cover your eyes the whole time," she said. "Look, you don't have to look at me. Just look at your watch." Michael heard Sarah pulling herself out of his car. He lifted his left hand and immediately noticed that the flesh on his hand was perfectly intact. The light blinded his eyes. They had become so used to the darkness. It was a yellow light, the kind from light bulbs. Through his tears, it was nearly impossible to see his watch. But he pulled his hand close to see. 6:24. Time was moving again. He lifted his right hand and looked at his car clock. 6:24. He dared to sneak a look. He peeked over the ends of his shoes to see a pair of dark jeans and the bottom of a white blouse. He lifted his head farther to see the ends of beautifully curled golden hair. And he sat up, now in the passenger seat, but he could see Sarah's warm, smiling face looking back at him. Michael practically exploded out of his car and grabbed her. He pulled her into an embrace that would crack ribs if she hadn't been prepared for it. He put his hand on the back of her head and kissed her. Tears streamed down his face still, but they were tears of the purest joy. Michael heard a harsh, cackling sound from behind him, and from his tear-restricted vision he saw lush gardens and a rich-looking mansion. In the high archway that led to the door stood a couple. The laughing one was in a wheelchair, and he had long, stringy gray hairs. The other was an old man staring at the couple, his hands in his pockets, staring very sympathetically at Michael. Michael laughed to himself and pulled Sarah into a kiss again, hoping that this one would never end. My town is one of those backcountry, middle-of-nowhere places in which word of mouth, folklore, and wild superstition defines its population. It's the kind of place a visitor might hear ethereal music in the woods, or catch a glimpse of an out-of-place animal roaming the empty fields. If your senses are attuned to such things, and you might even notice strange graves carved into the slopes of the gullies, or old ropes tied to the limbs of withered trees, their trunks riddled with bullet holes. But we know of something else. Ineffable horrors dwelling in the depths of an abandoned, isolated coal mine. Local legend tells of a pit, a dark place in which some 300 miners lost their lives in a colliery disaster over a century ago. So the story goes, a number of miners had complained about the perilous conditions in the mine on several occasions, many citing bad omens, including the presence of carrion crows in the subterranean depths, and some even claiming to hear the unlikely neighing of startled horses in the ghastly myriad passageways. But the miners' pleas went unheard, resulting in the catastrophic explosion that led directly to their deaths. Whispers exchanged over an ale at the Painter's Greyhound tell of survivors, starving miners entombed into labyrinthine tunnels honeycombing the cold earth beneath our town. Occasionally the ground opens up and swallows things, dilapidated sheds and the corners of houses, sometimes people, fodder for the ravenous miners. And pets abandon their owners, dogs disappearing into shadowy recesses and cats straying deep into the wilderness, never to be seen again. As the saying goes here in my town, all victims of the pit. The location of the pit over the course of the century was mostly forgotten, knowledge of the disaster itself conveniently buried by those with more pressing political and financial interests. The Audis, though, as they're known in these parts, are still in possession of memories and often recount unsettling tales passed down through the generations. If it hadn't been for my grandfather, I, at the tender age of 14, might have never set out to find the pit that day. The route related to me was both protracted and disorienting. Seekers of the pit must first descend into the old ravine, my grandfather muttered through his false teeth, a route at one time commonly frequented by my sort. Follow the oaks and the silver birches along the old trail marked by the red bricks of Scoot's cottage, and you'll reach the Bald Hills. You know the bodies, don't you, boy? I nodded, for I did know the bodies, and still do. Unnatural rucks carved out by long-perished miners, barren and unwelcoming, suggestive of untold mysteries and the forbidden knowledge they serve to protect. My grandfather continued. That awkward terrain, boy, coupled with those dark ponds, can lead to one dogwood, a forested area intersected by confusing, abandoned lanes leading deep into what we call the sterile heart of the backcountry. You'll know dogwood by the density of the underbrush, though you'll have to look closely if you want to find the accursed entrance. To this day, I still don't fully understand why my grandfather encouraged me to seek it out. His warning as I left that day often returns to me on dark, foreboding autumn afternoons. Boy, there's nothing to look, just everything to see. See yourself and you know the escape to the darkness. But I was a 14-year-old lad. How was I to know what he meant? My best friend Key knocked on my door at 7:15 that fateful October morning. We walked the length of the park road and plunged headlong into the old ravine. The thing we sought somehow was already with us, and was working to discourage us, descending upon the golden-brown foliage in the form of mist. We pressed on. The discovery of the silver birches was fortuitous, for beyond them we soon observed the red bricks of Scooth's derelict cottage. Moss and creeping ivy caressed the old stones joylessly, consuming what had once been the jewel of the ravine. Just like Scooth, its time had passed. The cool morning air met us as we climbed the slopes and stepped out onto Bonnie's, also known as Bald Hills. It's quite a thing to experience both the absence and evidence of man simultaneously. But that's just how it was. Standing there on the old rocks, a man-made landscape, abandoned, nature working to reclaim what it once possessed. The gravelly mounds hissed at us, exposed to the brisk autumnal wind. Key and I traversed the hills hastily, avoiding the ponds, motionless bodies of water concealing horrible depths rumored to connect directly to the old tunnels, flooded passageways where the survivors were said to roam. In a moment of hesitation, we shuddered. We saw the tree line on the horizon, dense foliage forming a seemingly impenetrable wall. A cloud of mist hovered above the forest threateningly. It whispered, "Turn back." But we didn't turn back. We happened upon that most sought-after location, dogwood. Brushing the nettles and brambles aside, we discovered an old pathway, the tiniest amount of gravel still visible beneath the grass and weeds. Mist shielded much of what lay beyond, so we stepped onto the path and made the conscious decision to keep to it. Deeper and deeper we drove into the underbrush, working hard to clear the path of shrubbery and other hindrances, blind to the inherent dangers one should be aware of in the proximity of a disused coal mine. A capped shaft presented itself as such a danger, several rotten timber planks straddling its hideous mouth. Luck was the thing for preventing an unfortunate tumble into the blackness beneath. The remains of an old railway line brushed against our boots as we closed in on our destination, the innumerable limbs of large trees clawing at the rusty tracks zealously. Kia was the first to note the change in the air, a staleness, a rancidity that had visibly affected the flora of the wood. As we neared its source, we saw fewer and fewer nettles, brambles, and ferns, vegetation in general seemingly afraid to flourish in what my grandfather had referred to as the sterile heart of the backcountry. Withered trees stood defiantly, though the souls the roots might have once harbored had long since departed. Even the soil gelatinous mud had been affected by the otherworldly blight. And then we saw it, the great arch, making the entrance to the side of the pit. The arch, an iron monstrosity, once beheld the name of the mine, though upon our observations the bold lettering had mostly eroded. The rust-nimbled letters remained. P.I.T. Trepidation begged us to flee, to return to the familiar comforts of home, the quiet town center host to Marge's sandwich shop and Gilbert's newsagents, the ancient sprawling cemetery on Church Street, and Pollock's school for the deaf under the willows on Grundy Street. Even the lone silhouette of the lightning tree standing atop Broomhead's Will was an image I would have happily traded for that of the dark, deathly visage of the deepest dogwood, We trudged onwards until we came upon the mere. It filled us with dread. My father, a regular up at the Painter's Greyhound, said the seniors often spoke of an old mere, a pond but a stone's throw away from the pit. Allegedly, the old miners used to wash their hands and faces in it, steadily darkening the water with coal. Other kids, in times gone by, who had set out in search of the mine, had happened upon the mere. Alarmed by the shade of water, most had turned back, though some strayed too near and were never seen again. One lad, the Audis would say, caught a glimpse of something strange in the still water, and in the grip of some inexplicable mania, fled and threw himself into the pit. Witnesses, 2 of them returned from the wood in a near catatonic state, claiming the lad was pulled into the mouth by dark, ashen hands. The lad, like the others, was never seen again. There was no investigation into his disappearance. The Audis say the lad was cursed. That there's mere's a reflection in there, that pit. That lad should have kept his eyes off both. He's got first see these selves if thee wants first to live. Braver than most, Key and I approached the old mere and glared into the murky water. I swear to this day, I've never seen water as dark. The face that looked back at me, a strange, warped version of my own, haunts me to this day. As for Key, he offered no description of what he saw in there. Stepping away from the mere, we scanned our immediate surroundings beyond a smattering of withered silver branches. A trail marked by a rusty chain-linked fence led to our destination. Tentatively we approached, mindful of the eroded metal fencing poking up out of the gelatinous earth, sharp and menacing. Some 15 paces further and we were upon it. The pit. Blackened charcoal-like trees loomed eerily above it, their poisoned limbs hanging limply, pointing toward the untold depths below. I still have difficulty describing it. Not in terms of its outward appearance, as quite simply it was nothing more than a hole in the ground, some 15 feet in diameter. No, it was the inexplicable sensation that gnawed at my nerve endings and tugged at my faculties. That's what I had a difficulty describing. To say the urge to flee was overwhelming would be an understatement. Staring into that black abyss evoked an emotional response unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It was as though Key and I discovered the eye of Mother Earth herself, and to look directly into it was a sin punishable by a fate worse than death. And we had been warned. The folk who fell into sinkholes, the curious kids who mysteriously disappeared, the pets that strayed too far from their owners, all victims of whatever it was that roamed those unfathomable passageways at the bottom of that cursed pit. As the eye glared up at us, my thoughts returned to that peculiar reflection I'd gazed upon in the mirror. And then there was movement below. I looked to Key and shivered. There was no conceivable way down into the pit, and as such, no conceivable way up out of it. Was there? The movement came in the form of a sound, a shuffling, labored progression, the sound of frail, ashen hands clutching blindly at the roots of dead trees. As the unsettling imagery sketched itself in my mind's eye with an incredible urgency, the all-consuming rancid odor grew in its potency, so much so that I could almost taste it, my senses utterly assaulted by it. The clamor neared the surface, threatening to make eye contact with us in a matter of moments. Key and I stood, frozen to the spot, lips cracked, throats dry, inhaling the foul odor as it crept toward us. Seekers of the pit, the 2 of us, sincerely regretting our inquisitiveness and impudence. Key and I stood, frozen to the spot, lips cracked, throats dry, inhaling the foul odor as it crept toward us. Seekers of the pit, the 2 of us, sincerely regretting our inquisitiveness and impudence. As the nameless thing neared the surface, I turned and fled. Moments later, Key was at my rear. Headless we were of the metal fragments strewn across the trail. Ignorant we were of the shadowy mere and the boggy underfoot as we raced out of Dogwood. Oblivious we were to the strange absence of fauna throughout the bald hills. Unconcerned we were as once again we plunged into the old ravine, passing Scooth's cottage and the silver birches. Thrilled we were as we made it to the safety of Park Road, gasping and collapsing to the merciful tarmac of a familiar thoroughfare. As Key and I walked home, not a single word was exchanged. Key and I attended school together the following day, but neither of us discussed the pit. That was our unspoken agreement, both secretly terrified, afraid that spoken acknowledgement of the thing we both knew was out there would confirm it, invite it back into our lives. But our pact didn't last. It should have lasted till the end of our days. We bumped into each other some 5 years later at the bar in Painter's Greyhound on a dreary autumn evening. The memories spilled out of us, and though several Audis were eavesdropping, none of them had a word to say. Like the church steeple at the heart of our town, one memory stood out above the rest. A memory the both of us had attributed to the sword weaving of a nightmare. There in that quiet pub, we described the strange sounds and the hideous fear we sensed in that instant before we took flight. But as I spoke of the moment, I turned and fled. Key spoke of something else, something deplorable. From out of the pit had emerged the ashen hands and charcoal face of a long-dead miner. He claimed the very same face had replaced his reflection in the mirror. Its empty eyes studied him, and as it pointed a pallid finger in his direction, it whispered, "We are coming." It was with those fateful words Key had turned and fled. At the bar his face fell, the color running out of it completely. He looked up at me. "They're coming for me. I know it." The next day I received a telephone call. I recognized the caller as Daniel Tately, Key's younger brother. Daniel was morose, his voice but a whisper at the end of the line. There had been an incident at the Tately bungalow, one involving a sinkhole. I shuddered at the implications. The family had awoken in the early hours of the morning to a series of tremendous crashing sounds. Daniel and his parents, the latter of whom still refused to discuss the incident, rushed to Key's bedroom, flung the door open and stood aghast as their son, brother, and my friend was dragged kicking and screaming into a gaping hole, malnourished, ashen hands clutching his head and arms. All this Daniel muttered in hushed tones. He spoke of Key's paranoia in the weeks leading up to the incident, an apparent preoccupation with the subterranean mines beneath our town, fears related to the distant, muffled sound of pickaxes, and the latent idea that a nameless thing from the heart of the mines had spent 5 long years searching for him. In his mind's eye he had watched as it traversed the flooded depths, clearing collapsed corridors, looking for the precise location in which to dig hundreds of feet upwards. And he had listened as the encroaching clamor fueled his imagination, coupled with what Daniel referred to as an odor, an overpowering fear that even the family had noticed in the days leading up to the incident. "It got him," Daniel said. And it had. The pit, the occupants of the pit. Life in my town carries on. The few of us who remember such horrors exchange our tales and whispers over quiet ales in the Painter's Greyhound on chilly autumnal nights. Occasionally I revisit that fateful moment Key and I gazed into that old mirror. I saw myself. Key saw something else. As my grandfather once said, "Boy, 'tis nothing to look, 'tis everything to see. See yourself and know thee escaped the darkness." Now I finally knew what he meant. The first thing I remember of my arrival to Otahuihiho, the small Native American village in the northern reaches of Minnesota, was the smell. The familiar aroma of soaked dirt permeated the air and was instantly noticeable as soon as the doors of the cramped 12-seater plane were opened. The runway that we landed on almost looked like it could have been constructed a month ago. Not at all because it looked new, but because it looked so basic, like it was built for my arrival only. The dirt runway stretched about 950 meters and was accompanied by only a small, 1-story concrete building. I'd come to this godforsaken no man's land in order to research for a book. I was an aspiring author, planned on writing a fictional story set in the wild, and needed inspiration. I was also interested in the local legends of the area, and the mysterious deaths that were rumored to have taken place near town. I was not excited about camping in the coldest regions of the country and being torn from my luxuries for 2 months, but I did it in the name of gathering useful information and becoming inspired. What I experienced, though, is something I can barely bring myself to recollect. A thick pine forest surrounded the runway entirely, with only one solitary trail leading to the main village. I could see patches of unmelted snow that punctuated the landscape and gave the entire area perpetual moisture. I was still taking in the surroundings when my bags were stripped from my hands and loaded into a pickup truck by a thick, robust man who looked to be about 6'6". Just as I opened my mouth to object, a much smaller man stepped out from the truck and came to meet me. "Patrick McLaren?" he said curtly. "Yes." I was too startled by the bear of a man who had loaded my bags to give an articulate response. "Afternoon. I'll be helping you settle in. As soon as your possessions are taken care of, we'll drive to town." The bear never said a word and effortlessly tossed the rest of my luggage, which I'd considered quite heavy, into the bed of the pickup. The shorter man motioned for me to get into the passenger seat of the truck and shut the door. The bear hopped into the bed of the pickup, and I swear to God the entire vehicle lurched like a boulder had been dropped in. The shorter man hopped into the driver's side, and before I had time to say anything, hit the gas like he had no time to waste. "Now that we're off, I suppose it's time I give you the details. My name's Adrian. I'll be showing you around, getting you settled in your new lodgings." I continued scanning the forest. I could just barely make out small clearings that were spaced out every couple 100 yards. "All right," I responded. "Hey, how do you know my—" I stopped. Something had just briefly flashed through my peripheral vision. As I turned to look, I was greeted with the same comforting but somehow menacing pines. "Your name?" "It's easy. You're the only one who's come here for weeks. We don't get many tourists around these parts. There's only one name on the ledger and only one man on the plane. I put 2 and 2 together." This left me unsettled, but it made sense. The town is secluded and had little to offer a normal person. We soon arrived at Otonowiho, and I was checked into the inn. My room was a loft on the 2nd floor, and every item in it seemed to be cloaked in a thin layer of dust. Oh well, I thought. I'll only be staying here for one night. I was brought down to the lobby to meet my guide, the man I'd be sharing a tent with for a month. "Patrick," the short man said, "this is Abraham. He'll be your guide in the wilderness, and he'll give you an insight onto the more in-depth aspects of our culture." I extended a hand, which he firmly shook. "Nice to meet you," Abraham said with a nearly expressionless face. "Well then, now that the introduction's over, I'd say you both better get a good night's sleep. You'll need it." The frigid morning air chilled me to the core. Even under 3 layers, I was shivering. I could barely feel my nose. Abe and I set out on a small trail and walked for about an hour before we got to our campsite. Something wasn't right. My guide seemed tense, overly so, constantly whipping his head to face something that I could never see, never letting his guard down. Our campsite was in the middle of a large clearing next to a half-frozen lake. I didn't like being in the dead center of the meadow. It made me feel so vulnerable. After the tent was pitched, and I went on a short walk around the vicinity. I couldn't shake this feeling of being followed. The eerie veil hung over the very atmosphere of the place. Every time I was sure something would be behind me, I turned around to find absolutely nothing. And yet every time I tried focusing on the beautiful scenery, the more haunting it became. By nightfall, I was already regretting this trip. In addition to the lingering paranoia, winds had picked up. Not strong, but just enough to make the hairs on the back of your neck stand upright. We made a fire and cooked some beans in a pot, but whenever I finally felt relaxed, I'd see something that would make my blood run cold. A figure, just barely visible, darting into the forest, a twig snapping a few yards behind me. Just something that would put me on edge again. Abe and I climbed back into the tent and bundled ourselves into sleeping bags. It felt good to be out of the open, but the sobering reality that the only thing separating me from the outside was a thin piece of fabric settled in as well. I fell asleep surprisingly soon, but was woken up by the wind. It was no longer an eerie breeze, but a vehement, blustering storm. The tent was flapping and shaking wildly, and I could hear the trees and grass swaying and rustling violently. I tried to ignore it, and buried myself in my sleeping bag, but several minutes later I heard something that guaranteed me no sleep for the rest of the night. I could hear the wind calling something. The only way I recognized this is because the wind had a pattern, the whistling repeated in a way that was unmistakably a voice. After listening for several minutes, I could make out what it was calling. Defago. I had no idea what it meant, but to me it sounded like a name. Defago. Defago. I could barely contain myself. I rolled onto my other side to face Abe. Do you fucking hear that? When I looked over at him, he was huddled in the corner of the tent, shaking with his head buried in his knees. Abraham, what the hell is this? He didn't look up. Hey, are you alright? What the fuck is going on? Still nothing. I moved toward him and touched his shoulder, which caused him to snap his head up at me with a look of the most genuine terror I'd ever seen. We have to go. Have to go now. Now. Have to go. We have to go now. He stammered. It's not safe. We have to go. As he said this, he began to get up and move toward the tent flap. Stop. No, we're not going out there. I don't know what the hell's happening, but going out there's the last thing I'm doing. He wasn't fazed by this whatsoever and continued crawling over me. As he reached for the zipper, I grabbed his arm. Abe, you cannot leave me out here. He continued to wrestle with the zipper, and I grabbed his other shoulder to try and keep him settled. He grew even more frantic and delivered a strong kick to my chest. I let go of him and fell back down to the tent floor. He opened the tent flap and ran off into the night. Are you insane? You can't leave me out here! I screamed at him. I quickly lost sight of him. When I looked down into the night, I was stunned by what I saw. The air was still. The trees and grass were motionless. This is impossible, I thought. Seconds ago, the entire tent was being ravaged by a windstorm. Even worse, the wind became silent. I heard screaming, and identified it as Abe. He drew off into the distance and became inaudible. I wanted to cry. I zipped the tent flap up faster than I had ever done anything in my life and huddled in the corner, listening to the intense silence that hung over the outside. I woke, surprised. Not startled by anything, but surprised. Surprised that I somehow fell asleep, even while gripped by the most intense fear I'd ever felt in my life. After making sure that there was nothing outside waiting for me, I gathered my courage and stepped out. The morning air was crisp and as freezing as ever. My mission was to make it back to Otsunuiho. I didn't bother getting the tent. I simply didn't care. All I grabbed was my knife, a jacket, a few granola bars before heading out. I noticed that in the patches of snow, there were footprints. At first, resembling human footprints, but then becoming distorted. They became longer, more stretched out after a while. I was sure that they were not footprints coming from a human, not even an animal. The longest set of these prints I saw was roughly 5 feet. In fact, my own imagination couldn't create a monster with feet of this caliber. And then it dawned on me. They weren't footprints. I mean, they were at first. I could see the pattern at the bottom of Abe's boots imprinted in the snow, but the long ones? Absolutely not. No. They were drag marks. The long tracks in the snow were evidence of Abraham's futile resistance to being pulled and dragged by something. Oh my God, I whispered to myself. I sprinted out of the meadow with a pace that would rival Olympic athletes. I turned what was once an hour-long hike into a 35-minute dash. I wanted to throw my guts up by the time I reached the village. I was greeted by several caring townspeople and was escorted to the local tavern for some hot food and drink. An older native of the town sat down with me and listened to my account of the events. I swear to God of my life and every dead ancestor I have ever had that what I'm saying is true. I expected skepticism, but received a genuine concern from the man. And I think this may have troubled me even more. I see, he responded. The name. What was the name being called? I tried to recollect what I'd heard. I don't know. Defago, that's it. The look on the old man's face told a story on its own. Why? Does that mean something? Is it important at all? The man remained silent for a few seconds before responding. Defago was a prominent hunter. He lived many years ago, before I was born. And one night he never returned. The same night, a horrible storm came over the entire region. He quickly ended the sentence and looked down at the table, looking as though he'd made a mistake. I was frustrated at this horribly vague and seemingly useless information. I could tell he was holding something back, something important. And? What happened? How is that important? What the hell does this all mean? I responded rather aggressively. The old man sat still as a statue for what seemed like ages, but finally whispered, "The Wendigo." Every head in the tavern simultaneously turned and glared at the back of the man's head, and then turned to me. What the hell is a Wendigo? The tavern patrons continued glaring at both of us with a twisted look of suspicion and fear. Even the bear looked worried. Reluctantly, the old man responded, "It's something we try to escape." My look of confusion at his answer must have spurred him into elaborating. The legend holds that it survives on the flesh of humans. It may have even been human once before, but no longer. It's a vile creature. It stands taller than any man and can strip the flesh from bones. It grows stronger with every acknowledgement of its existence and seems to have returned from whatever darkness it is hidden in for so long. He paused. Before, the Wendigo took only several people a year. We simply accepted it as life. The man turned to face the rest of the tavern goers. Over time, the town vowed to adopt a silence, never to speak of or even acknowledge the Wendigo, and soon, miraculously, the abductions waned. I looked up from my food, trying to process what I was hearing. And Defago? The man nodded. Defago was the man who attempted to conquer the Wendigo. Like I said, he never returned. But there was one thing that didn't add up. Abraham. Why was he so disturbed? Why was he driven insane by the wind, and why did he frantically dart into the night like a madman? What did Abraham have to do with any of this? A somber look came over the man's face. It's time for you to go home. Adrian can arrange your flight to be rescheduled for tomorrow morning. I got up to leave, and as I walked through the door, the bar patrons never shifted their gaze from me. I wanted answers, but I was exhausted and already overwhelmed by this impossible information. After weighing my options, I decided that I had to spend another night out in the woods. To this day, I have no idea what overcame me. I can't imagine what could have motivated me to spend a night in the belly of the beast that not 12 hours before had abducted and most likely killed an innocent man. Whether it was the goal of being able to write about my experiences, a need for closure, or pure delirium, something made me go back out there. My walk through the woods was even worse, because this time I was alone. I didn't even try to convince anyone to go with me. Something told me that I doomed the entire town just by raising this monster from the dead, breaking the silence. The ever-present voyeuristic and dreadful paranoia was now piled on with a load of guilt. I finally made it to my camping grounds and noticed that not much had changed. The looming trees remained standing, and the sickening drag marks on the snow still sat on the ground. I couldn't take it. I kicked the snow over to erase the marks and footprints. I followed the tracks, continuing to erase them to the tree line, the edge of the meadow. I could see the kicked up dust and dirt in the woods, but there was something else. A massive wound on a tree, like someone had taken a jackhammer through it. And on another one, just a few feet further away, there was what appeared to be a massive claw mark, almost like when a wolf marks their territory. But this looked as if something had just scraped it while walking through the forest. I felt sick. I went back to my tent and waited for nightfall. The wind picked up again. Not nearly as bad, but still enough to shake the tent. And I knew it was time. I stood up and got out of the tent. The night was illuminated by a soft but passing moonlight as the clouds repeatedly obscured it from view. This time the wind had a physical effect. I could see the tree swaying softly and the grass pressed over in one direction. I couldn't tell if this was comforting or not. I switched on my flashlight and scanned the perimeter. Nothing. After standing in the wind for a while longer, I decided to go back to my tent and wait some more. I turned on my heel and nearly fainted at what I saw. And there it was, standing directly behind the tent. It towered at least a foot taller than me and looked straight down with eyes like a hawk. Its head resembled that of a human, but it had teeth like a canine. In place of a nose, there was a short bulldog-like snout, and long, wispy facial hair sat on its face. I could see pointy ears poking through the long, grayish-black mane that ended just before its waist, with locks of hair hanging over its shoulders. But its arms... oh God, its arms. They were incredibly long, with its fingers ending below its knees. Its fingernails looked as though they could carve through steel. The body was lean and sinewy, with a pale gray complexion hidden under a very thin layer of hair and fur. The lower body looked as though it was covered by torn cloth wrapped around the waist, and I could see a fragment of the leather jacket worn by my former guide. I knew what it was. There was no mistaking it. It was what I was told of, warned of. It was the Wendigo. My voice was lost. I could barely breathe, let alone form a coherent thought. I didn't know what to do. I took a step back, but before my feet even touched the ground, it suddenly crouched and leaped over the tent on all fours, knocking into me and ripping through my side with its massive talons. I scrambled to get away and began to frantically crawl toward the tree line. Violently snarling, it grabbed my leg and pulled me back at least 5 feet. My God, its strength was incredible. I was nearly lifted off the ground by force. I rolled onto my back and met its gaze yet again. I could see its hot breath steaming out of its nose in the cold night air. It let out a blood-curdling screech and pounced on me. I rolled with great pain several feet away, narrowly missing the creature's fatal strike. On its fours, it turned to face me again. I pulled out my knife, faced it upward, and closed my eyes. This was it. I would die, but at least I would get one good shot in. It leaped for me, but was impeded by the blade. I heard the knife stick into the right side of its chest, causing the monster to release a foul screech a mere foot from my ears. Its breath stunk of rotting flesh and stale blood, and nearly made me vomit. My ears rang, but I somehow got to my feet and began a desperate adrenaline-fueled sprint to the tree line. As my hearing returned, I listened to the monster snarling with anger behind me. I hoped against hope that it hadn't begun to chase after me, because if it did, I was done for. I made it to the edge of the forest and dodged several of the massive pines while continuing to hold my bleeding abdomen. I could make out the trail in the dim moonlight and summed up all the strength I had to make it there. I never slowed my pace, for fear that if I let up for even a second, I'd be back in the arms of that beast. I ran out onto the trail and was instantly assaulted by a blinding light and a force that felt as if an elephant had rammed into me. Before I knew it, I was flying and landed with a thud onto the dirt road. I opened my eyes and saw 3 figures. 2 of them were natives of Otanuiho, stepping out of the truck they had just hit me with. The other was the Wendigo. I was standing silhouetted against the moon at the edge of the dirt path opposite me. It ripped the knife from its chest and dropped it to the ground with almost an air of arrogance. I tried to get to my feet, but felt fiery, staggering pain in my left leg. One of the men helped me to my feet and practically dragged me to the vehicle and tossed me into the truck bed like I was a sack of potatoes. The force of landing on my broken leg brought tears to my eyes, but I was too relieved to care. The man who brought me to the truck was the bear. I didn't have to see his face to know whose body and personality that belonged to. The other man stood in terror in front of the monster, raising a pistol before him. Before the man could pull the trigger, the Wendigo grabbed him and dragged him off into the woods. I could hear screaming and the sound of boots scraping against the earth and snow. I don't remember what happened after that. I woke up in a hospital in Minneapolis, where a pretty nurse told me in a comforting voice that I was brought there by a helicopter after a man found me on a trail. Apparently I was attacked by a bear on a rock climbing expedition. I knew it to be completely untrue, but I just nodded my head and on the pillow. Now I'm here. Many years later, with a family of my own, I realized I could never publish what I saw in a book. If it really does grow strong with belief in its existence, I just couldn't. Who knows what I've doomed Otanuiho to after going hunting for this thing? Generations of torment? I don't know. Recording this here and putting it out on this site, it gives me closure in a way. Just letting it out and being able to tell my story, it helps. At least here, no one will take it seriously. I just learned a few years ago, after researching the small town, that Defego, the hunter, was Abraham's great-grandfather, and that Abraham's own daughter was taken by the Wendigo 10 years before I arrived in town. I felt bad that he died the way he did, but maybe now he's with her somewhere. I like to think that. Some people can move on from traumatic events, and I guess in a way I have. And I still get paranoid when the wind picks up. Can't stand going on camping trips to this day, and on some nights, I swear I can still hear the wind calling my name. There are now few left alive who remember the song and dance man. Time has claimed the ones that survived the long night, and I'm sure they went willing to meet their maker. Life takes on a strange tint after a night like that. The ones still left, Bill Parker, Sarah Carter, Sam Tannen, they don't talk about it. Sam is lucky. His brains started to turn to porridge a few years back, and now he has trouble figuring out how to put on his pants. He got an early reprieve from his memories. He doesn't wake up night after night, the music still playing in his ears, tears still drying on his cheeks. The Song and Dance Man came to Belcarn with a little fanfare in the fall of 1956. I had just gotten out of high school and was working as a stock boy at Handy's Hardware. It was there in the afternoon that Sarah Carter burst through the door, making the bell over the door jingle like mad. "George, you gotta see what's been set up by the buy stand. There's this huge tent up and the man in front's yelling like a carnival barker." Sarah was out of breath and obviously had run from the park and all the way down Main Street. Her hair was whipsawed every which way and one strand stuck to the end of her nose. She gave a quick puff and blew it out of the way and waited for me to react. With Sarah, I was always 2 steps behind and running to catch up. The girl had energy in those days and in an unlimited supply. I stopped rearranging the nails and said, "Wasn't anything up there when I walked by there this morning. When did it go up?" She shrugged her shoulders in a quick raise and drop. "Dunno, but it's up. You gotta see this guy. He's all dressed up too, head to toe, and he can talk. Boy, he can talk." I thought about it and checked the clock. It was near 5 and about time for me to quit anyway. "All right, let's go check it out then." Sarah grinned from ear to ear and was gone. I didn't doubt she was telling everyone in the gang, the ones that were still in town anyway. Most of us scattered to the 4 winds after graduation. Only a handful of us remained in town, and only a handful of us were on hand to witness the dance. I walked down to the bandstand myself, not bothering to wait for the others. Most likely Sarah was already there waiting for us. I met up with Bill as I passed the drugstore, where he worked as a soda jerk. "What the hell's Sarah talking about, George? She blew in here and blew out again before I could ask her anything." Bill was a big guy, tallest and heaviest guy in our class, and I just about cracked up the first time I saw him wearing that little peaked paper cap McCleary made his soda jerks wear. Bill doesn't really like to be laughed at, though, and after the knot under my eye went down, I made sure not to laugh at him anymore. He's a good guy, aside from that temper. He was the best guy on the high school basketball team, too, though he's one of the few who got kicked out of the game. Threw another player halfway down the court, and they were on the same team. Bill said the other guy elbowed him in the gut. Had to have been by accident. No one would have done it on purpose. We both walked down the street, Bill smoking a cigarette, a habit that caught up to him in 1995 when they removed his right lung. At the end of Main Street, we crossed Buchanan and entered the park. Normally at that point, we would have been able to see the bandstand, perched on a hill near the center of the park. During the summer, there'd be concerts, performances by a high school marching band, a church of choir singers, some hymns, things like that. Once a couple of kids from the high school had put together a pretty good rockabilly group, but somehow the parks committee passed an ordinance that banned rock and roll in the park. Small town things, you know? But now, there was a huge, faded yellow tent blocking the bandstand. Like the kind in the circus, or the kinds those old revival ministries like to use when they're feeling the spirit, and they like to feel your wallet, too. There was already a pretty large crowd around the tent, and as Bill and I got closer, we could hear the fellow that Sarah had told us about. He sounded like a carnival barker, all right. Bill and I walked faster down the path that led to the tent. We pushed our way through the crowd, up toward the tent and where we thought the man was. "Come on, everybody, it's getting close, getting close. We're going to have ourselves a heck of a time tonight. Yes, indeed, a heck of a time. We'll be singing, we'll be dancing. I promise that the Song and Dance Man always keeps his promises." We still couldn't see him. Still too many people blocking the way. It looked like the whole town had shown up to see the Song and Dance Man. Bill tugged at my sleeve and pointed. I followed his finger, and he got bug-eyed. It was Reverend Harper, the Baptist minister. I've lived a good long time, but I never seen a man that could thump a Bible harder than he. Harper preached against the evils of sin, sin in drinking, sin in smoking reefer, sin in smoking tobacco, sin in lying, and most of all, sin in dancing. And here he was, lining up to get inside the tent too, because he certainly wasn't preaching. We waved at him, Bill waving with the hand that held the cigarette, and that old Baptist turned red as the Red Sea and turned and walked away. Bill and I grinned at each other and kept on walking toward the front and toward the song and dance man. Finally, we broke through the crowd, and there he was. He stood on an old crate, splintered and looking like it was on the verge of collapsing under his feet. On the grass behind him lay a black fiddle case with a gold trim along its edges. It looked old, older than the crate, older than the town. It seemed like something ancient. He was all angles, all knees, elbows, and shoulders, tall and gangling, his body moving and bopping to the rhythm of his words. He wore a red and white pinstripe jacket, looking like he belonged in a barbershop quartet. A straw hat sat on his head, always getting pushed back or pulled forward by his long-fingered hands. Long, 6-fingered hands. I started when I saw that. I read that if some folks are born with 6 fingers, but reading about it and seeing it are 2 different things. His eyes just about flashed blue lightning as he spoke, and sparks nearly flew from those white teeth. And he just never stopped talking, not for a breath, not for questions, not for anything. Just kept up the patter like his very soul depended on it. All right, we're getting close, getting real close, yes we are. Are you ready to dance? Are you ready to sing? 'Cause I'm ready to play fiddle, yes I am. Got a fiddle at my feet and I'm ready to play, ready to make those strings sing, can you believe it? He'd clap his hands, and that's as close as he'd come to pausing. Sarah and Sam came up to us now, having found us in the crowd. Sarah elbowed me in the rib. What'd I tell you? Looks like you should have been in a carnival trying to get us to see some bearded lady or something. Sam nodded his head in greeting to us, which caused his glasses to slide down his nose, and he gave them a short push back up to where they belonged. He was as tall as Bill, but nowhere as built. He was the smart guy in our gang. You had to have someone like him around to tell you how to do things like take apart the principal's car and rebuild it in the school gym. Not that we ever did anything like that. "What's he selling?" asked Sam. "A dance, I figure," I said. "What's it cost?" The song and dance man must have heard him because he said, "What does it cost, I hear you ask? Why, it doesn't cost $1, it doesn't cost a quarter, it doesn't cost a dime. Folks, it'll cost you nothing. Just get on and dance and sing all night long." We all looked at each other. Good deal. A little music, free space to dance. There wasn't much to do in town back in those days, and there still isn't. This was almost too good to be true. The song and dance man stopped now, a minor miracle in and of itself. He dug deep into his pocket, pulled out a gold watch, and checked the time. And then he grinned a grin that must have shown every one of his teeth. He pocketed the watch and said, "Folks, it's time for the dance, so come on in, everybody, because it's time for the dance to begin." And with that, he hopped down from his crate, grabbed it up with the fiddle, and darted through the tent flaps. Sarah, Bill, Sam, and I nearly got mowed over in the rush to get inside, but we were still the first ones in. We stopped short when we pushed aside those big old tent flaps, but were quickly driven inside. It was huge inside. There was a hardwood floor beneath our feet that looked like it must be oak, a dark, dark oak, polished to a mirror shine. There were candles and holders all along the tent post, and when I looked up I couldn't see the ceiling for all the darkness. It was like looking up at a starless night sky, where the moon didn't dare to show her face. The crowd kept driving us, and more people poured in. It wasn't just the young people either. There was Mrs. Crenshaw, our junior-year English teacher who was in her 50s. There was Mr. Hoskins, the principal. There was the good old Reverend Harper, still looking embarrassed, but also like he couldn't help himself. He really was nearly the whole damn town. Hell, even the mayor was there with his wife, standing and talking with the chief of police. Soon everyone was inside, and the murmur from all the talking was nearly deafening. It was already getting warm in there, and I was feeling cramped and claustrophobic. We were all looking for the song and dance man, to see where he had gone. No one looked up, so no one saw him until the first pull of his fiddle bow. He was there, on the center tent pole, sitting on a small wooden platform about 20 feet from the floor. God knows how he got up there, because there certainly wasn't any ladder going up. He dangled his feet over the edge and held his fiddle in one hand and bow in the other. The fiddle and bow seemed to be made of that same dark wood that the floor was, and gleamed in the candlelight like a thing alive. I almost doubted that the fiddle even needed the song and dance man to make its strings hum. We all looked up at him and grinned and jumped to his feet while the crowd gasped, worried he might plummet into their midst. And then he began to play. And he made those strings sing. I haven't heard anyone play like that before or since, and I thank God for that every day. It made the air around us crackle and spark. It loosened the joints and jolted the mind. You felt the urge to move deep in the bone, buried in the marrow. I grabbed Sarah's hands and we began to move across the floor, and everyone followed suit. Some with partners and some without. Some doing the foxtrot, some doing the waltz, some of us doing the twist. We danced, moved, shucked, jived, rocked, and rolled. I passed Reverend Harper, moving his feet in a clunky box step with Eloise Grindell, an old battle axe of a Catholic. I saw the mayor's wife waltzing with Dan Adams, one of our firemen. I swirled with Sarah, moving across the floor, bumping and jostling with the people around us. It was hot and getting hotter in there, and it wasn't long before it smelled of sweat and bodies moving against bodies. I felt dizzy, but we kept dancing together, kept dancing and not stopping. It was a while before I realized that the song and dance man was singing too, but in a language I didn't understand. He lorded over us, standing on that platform, making his fiddle sing and sing. His bow rose and fell, slid back and forth, side to side. He played like he talked, no breaks, no pauses, just a manic deluge of tunes while his tongue curled around the words that had no business being said in this world. I gave my head a shake as I spun with Sarah, and I realized my legs were tired. My feet ached and my lower back was beginning to throb. I checked my watch and realized that we'd been dancing for a solid hour. I shook my head again, trying to shake off the dozy feeling that was clouding my thinking. "Sarah?" I cleared my throat. I'd only spoken in a whisper. My tongue felt thick and funny. I tried again. "Sarah?" Louder this time, but she still didn't respond, and we kept dancing. I shook her, but she didn't respond. I kept shaking until I realized I was doing it in time with the music. So I just tried to stop. And I couldn't. I couldn't stop. Underneath the fog, I began to feel frightened. I began to see the faces of the other people now. I saw their terror. Reverend Harper's face must have grown redder than it had before. Sweat poured down his face, but still he kept moving, twirling Mrs. Grindle around and around, her head lolling from side to side. She'd fainted, but her feet were still moving. We moved past Bill, who danced with Susie Watkins, and I saw her frightened eyes darting around the room, but Bill bobbed his head in time with the music as his glassy eyes looked at nothing in particular. The song and dance man laughed from his perch and kept playing, tapping his feet. His eyes were glowing in that dark, humid place, glowed, and light glanced off the bow with each sweep. I heard a scream and swiveled my head to watch a woman drop to the floor holding her leg. She'd cramped up. I was envious. She got to stop. She got to rest. My own legs felt like dead wood, and the ache in my back had deepened. Then her partner stepped on her ankle, and I heard the crunch from across the room. He was still dancing, his eyes blank and empty as he moved. She screamed again and started to crawl away, but began to stand up instead. She started to dance, bringing her weight down on the broken ankle again and again and again. I turned away, but I couldn't block out the sound of her sobbing. The music ran on. I checked my watch again. It had been 3 hours now. We didn't flag, didn't falter. We kept up at the same speed as the fiddle. That damning fiddle. Wrapping our feet against the floor. Never mind the blisters that burst. Never mind broken toes or broken ankles. Never mind that deep pain buried in the spine that refused to go. Never mind the old hearts and bad knees. We kept up that frantic pace as one mass, a bobbing, thumping, jumping creature with one mind. Reverend Harper died at one point. I watched it happen. He was holding up the still fainted Mrs. Grindle, whose feet still moved with the music when he dropped her, and then fell to the floor. He twitched once, his feet beating a quick staccato rhythm, and then was still. Mrs. Grindle got back up and kept moving. I watched Harper as I danced, trying to see if he was breathing. He wasn't. I swear to you, he wasn't, but he still got back up. He was dead, but he still got back up and began to dance again. He turned to look at me, and he grinned at me, that song and dance man's grin. His eyes were red, filled with blood from whatever had broken in his brain. I watched as a single red tear rolled down his cheek. I shut my eyes and kept moving. Harper wasn't the last. He probably wasn't the first. The old and the sick were the first to drop. Exhaustion, heart attacks, hemorrhages somewhere deep inside. They died. And then they got back up and kept dancing, grinning their grins. I passed Sam and Lizzie. He lost his glasses at some point, his eyes darting around, terribly aware. I looked at his leg and saw a jut of bone tearing through his denim jeans. There was a trail of blood behind him, and as he swirled, a spray landed on the legs of the people around him. He stepped on that broken leg, twirled it, jumped on it. All in time with that fiddle. The night passed. I remember stepping on something at one point and realizing I'd just crushed Mrs. Dempsey's right hand. She was lying on her back on the dance floor. She'd been stepped on time and time again. I could even see a man's shoe print on her stomach. Her head had been caved in, her chest beaten, her dress had a sunken look. And she was still trying to get up and move. The smell of blood mixed with the sweat, and I couldn't breathe anymore. The air was thick from all around. I could hear cries, screams, but nothing that drowned out the fiddle or the song and dance man singing. And then it stopped. I danced one more step and then stopped myself. I looked up at the platform. We all did, craning our necks upwards. He was checking his pocket watch. All right, folks, that's all for tonight. The dancing is done and the morning has come. You may leave if you can walk, and you should walk quick because the song and dance man's going to be gone. We all stood there like stunned cattle and then marched to the tent flaps. No one ran because they couldn't. It was a miracle that we could walk. Sarah stepped ahead of me and left, but I stayed behind. I turned and looked, and saw at least 20 people still standing there. Harper was among them. They were all grinning, their eyes empty. They stood and made no sign of wanting to leave. Go on now, friend. The song dance man has what he wants, but he's glad to add you too if you tarry and dally too long. I looked up at him and saw him smile. Then I turned back and left the tent. When I turned back again, it was gone, along with the people inside. That's the story of what happened. The others won't tell it or pretend it never happened. Never mind the 21 people that vanished that night, the mayor's wife included. They'd rather not think about it. Sarah and I took Sam to the hospital over in the next county, far from folks that knew what had happened, where they had to remove his leg. Sam was quiet before and was quieter still after, pulling odd jobs that a one-legged man can do. Doesn't move around much nowadays, just sits on his porch, cane across his lap, and massages the stump with his hand. Says it bothers him on cold nights, and warm nights, and wet nights, and dry nights. Bill left and joined the army, staying in long enough to fight in Vietnam and won a bunch of medals. Came back and settled down to drink, and drink hard. If you want to find him, you can find him in Eddie Dixon's bar. No matter how drunk he gets, though, he doesn't talk about that night. None of us saw much of Sarah after. She came through the best, but that's how she always was. She left, went to college, but like Bill, she got pulled back into Belcarn. She teaches over at the high school now, teaching English to the juniors. And I stayed here, plugging away at the hardware store. I ran it for a while, but now I don't do much of anything. Just sitting around with Sam on his porch, talking about things sometimes. Well, not often. Because if I stay too late, stay too long, I'll see his eyes go glassy behind those Coke bottle lenses, and he'll disappear into himself. I'll catch him humming a faint trace of a song that hairs on my neck stand on end, and goosebumps rise up in my arms in great knots. My foot will start to tap out a small beat on the hardwood porch, and a big wide grin will spread across Sam's face. The grin of the song and dance man. I'm not a storyteller, which is fine because this isn't a story. It's an account of what happened to me and my best friend 3 years ago. I'm writing it down now because therapy and medication hasn't helped me much. Maybe if I was honest with my therapist about what really happened, it would be more effective, but I think they just think I was lying or crazy. So, I'll write my confessions here. I might delete it when I'm done, but I doubt it. It's not a real confession if no one hears it. Instead, I'll post it somewhere on the internet anonymously. People won't believe it, but that's on them, right? Maybe it'll finally be enough. I didn't know what was in that house before I convinced Marcy we should go there. I swear to God I didn't. Sure, we'd both heard stories about it. Someone died there, maybe killed themselves, and maybe it was haunted. But it was a small town, kid bullshit haunted. There was probably a dozen places across the county with stories like it attached to them, and even growing up, we hadn't really believed there was anything in any of those places beyond some mice and maybe a raccoon or a snake. The stories were told by parents to entertain and warn us away from dangerous abandoned places, and they were passed between us kids much for the same reason. The idea of something dark and magical and dangerous was appealing, even if we didn't believe it in our heart of hearts. By the time Marcy and I were home for Christmas break on our senior year of college, you'd think we'd have outgrown some of that. But being back together always set us back a few years, and this was our last Christmas where the routine of college and coming home for the holidays guaranteed us a week together again. There was a bit of unspoken desperation between us, the shadowy fear that after fully entering the adult world, we might grow apart. Maybe that fear is what pushed me to go to the house, to see if I could still convince her to do stupid stuff and have fun in the process. Maybe that's why she said yes, because like me, she was afraid of losing what we had. Either way, it only took me a few minutes of talking it up on a boring Thursday night before we got into my truck and headed toward where the house sat crouched at the edge of town. The house had no name, no grand history that we knew about other than the shabby stories of possible deaths and ghosts. It was a large house, built in what some people call Victorian, but it was really just a mishmash of curves and straight edges and styles, with a big wraparound porch, rows of narrow windows on the upper floor that somehow reminded me of the gill slits on a shark. At one time it had been white, but that night it looked a sullen gray that seemed to softly glow in the sliver of moonlight we had to see by. It was like some bioluminescent mushroom that had grown up from the guts of some deep cave instead of having been built and lived in by people. I remember shaking my head as we stood out at the road, wondering where all these strange thoughts were coming from. Sharks and fungus, and Marcy was already walking up the overgrown driveway. "What are you doing?" I hissed the words at a whisper, though we were at least half a mile from the next house, and no one was going to care about us poking around there anyway. She looked back at me with a smirk. "You're the one that wanted to do this, pussy. Let's get in there and bust these ghosts." I felt my heart speed up slightly as I forced myself forward with a grimace. "Fine, hotshot. Let's see how you do when we get in there and a bat attacks your ass." She was terrified of bats, and I knew it, and she knew I knew it. Using her middle finger, she blew me a kiss as she reached the bottom of the porch steps. "Whatever. You see a bat coming, I expect you to take the hit for me. I'm not getting rabies on—" Her smile faded as she turned to look back up at the house, then back to me. "What's wrong?" She shook her head. I don't know. It just feels weird." Stepping up onto the porch, she paused for a moment before beckoning me to come up to where she was. I did, and as soon as I started stepping onto the porch, I knew what she meant. It wasn't a specific sense of something, not a smell or a sound or whatever. It wasn't even tied to a particular sensation or emotion other than some sense of alertness and fear that wasn't there before, like an antelope that raises its head nervously, knowing danger is near without understanding more. It was more the absence of a thing, an unnatural stillness. I'd call it a void, but that doesn't seem right, because part of the problem is the sense that the place wasn't empty. Just almost Empty. I know hearing this, you'd think there's no way we'd go further, right? We'd run back to my truck and go. Except everything I'm describing is my interpretation years later, based off of memory and hindsight. At the time, I don't know, maybe it was just us being stupid or too cynical or not wanting to look scared in front of the other one. Maybe we were being drawn in. All I know for sure is that when I met Marcy's eyes and nodded that I felt it too, neither of us mentioned leaving. Instead, we just held hands and walked up to the front door. The door was made of thick wood, strips of faded red paint running down and pooling its color around a rusty brass latch handle that I felt myself hoping would be locked. But of course not. The latch pushed down with the slightest press of my thumb, and when I pulled on the door, it opened easily with a soft, dusty squeal. Is this trespassing? Is this a crime? I looked over to see a mixture of worry, hope, and fear on Mary's face. She wanted me to say yes as much as I'd wanted the door to be locked. Instead, I shrugged. I mean, we don't have permission, but whose property is it? No one lives here or keeps it up. Does it count as trespassing when it's abandoned? Maybe technically, but... I left it hanging, waiting for her to pick up the thread. I honestly think if she'd bit just then, I'd have left. Instead, her shoulders slumped a little, and she gave a shrug. Yeah, I don't know. I guess let's get this over with. Getting out her flashlight, she shined it inside, lighting up a long, empty entry hall with doors along both sides. Tightening her grip on my hand, she pulled me inside. The hall gave me some hope at first. It wasn't clean. There were thick layers of dust and dirt everywhere, but there was no junk, no signs of disrepair, not even dead bugs or mouse droppings that I could see. Mary noticed it too and poked me inside. Isn't this weird? And I glanced at her, then back at the roving pool of light from my own flashlight. What? It's so clean. I mean, not clean, but empty. How isn't there any trash or roaches or whatever? I shrugged. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe they're further in. She snorted. Yay! Shining her light to the right, we headed into the first doorway. It was immediately clear that it wasn't empty, but it wasn't junked either. It was full of dusty furniture that seemed to be in good condition, except everything was upside down. The table, chairs, the sideboard, even the oriental rug in the center of the room that much of the other furniture rested on had all been flipped upside down, and not in some jumbled pile, but with everything pretty much in the same positions they would be if they were right side up. It was so odd that I found it disorienting. My mind trying to reconcile what I was seeing while coming up with some explanation for why it would look like that. Why is it like this? I heard an uncertain tremor in Mary's voice. I shook my head. I don't know. I mean, the furniture is kind of weird, but why do the rug like that too? I saw her nod out the corner of my eye as she started backing up. Let's try a different room, okay? I didn't argue as we passed back into the hall and across to the other side. This room was empty too, except for two dark blotches. One was on the carpet near the far wall, while the other was a few feet on the wall itself and going down into the carpet below. Jesus, do you think those are bloodstains? Marcy nodded. Maybe. It could be something else. Rust or water damage or something, but nothing really seems in bad shape. She glanced back behind us and to the other room. Are we done, or do we look around more? My tongue felt dry in my mouth. Maybe we go down the hall to one more room and then head out? Sound good? She gave me a nervous smile. Sure, let's just hurry. We stuck to the left side of the hall, and this time we found what had once probably been a normal living room. It had a sofa, a recliner, and a couple of tables, and across from that was a television, one of those giant rear projection TVs that was probably really nice 30 years ago. All of it was upside down. The furniture, the rugs, even the pictures on the walls were all upside down. We stood there together, moving our flashlights around and staring in growing confusion and fear at what we were seeing. None of this made sense. Some of these things, the angles they were sitting at, it didn't even make sense that they'd still be sitting up after so long. The dining room chairs had at least been partially propped against the legs of the table, but here, I don't know how a recliner and TV were even balanced like that. Marcy squeezed my hand hard. Let's get the fuck out of here. I didn't argue, and we immediately backed out of the room and turned to head to the front door, our lights flashing across the walls of the hallway as we prepared to run out. In those streaks, I saw several things at once. First, the front door, which we left open, was now shut. Second, something was written on the inside of the door, though it was too far away to read. Third, I saw someone move at the edge of the darkness. I pulled on Marcy's hand to make sure she didn't start forward as I leaned closer to whisper, "Someone. I think someone is in here with us." When I glanced at her, she was still staring forward, moving her flashlight around, but she gave me a quick, trembling nod as a single tear ran down her cheek. "Do we try to go out the front, or... She nodded again, her voice barely audible. "We don't know what's farther back. We try the door, and if it doesn't work, we break a window and climb out." Giving a small shudder, she added, "The rooms with the stains. We can use our flashlights. The other one is where it was standing." Heart pounding in my ears, I nodded and gave her hand another squeeze. "You stay here and look out while I go get the door open." Marcy looked at me with a frown. "No, we go together. Stay together." With that, she pulled me toward the front door, shining her light into the dining room, and we didn't see anyone in there. She shined it around behind us. I reached out for the door as my eyes landed on the words scratched into the white paint on the inside. "Beware the Harrow." It made me hesitate for a moment, but I pushed all my questions aside and grabbed at the knob, turning it hard while yanking at the door. It didn't budge. "What the fuck? It's coming." Marcy's voice was right behind me, still a whisper, but high and terrified. I looked behind me, past her, but I didn't see anything. "What? Where?" I yanked and twisted the knob again while still trying to see what she was talking about. "Oh God, it's reaching out." My body was vibrating with adrenaline, and I could hear the static of fear wanting to become shock crackling in my ears. "Marcy, I don't see it. She let out a gasp and started coughing hard, a deep hacking cough that doubled her over as her light bounced around the walls. I reached out to her, eyes looking everywhere as my other hand gave one last desperate tug at the door. It opened easily out into the world. Grabbing Marcy, I ran her outside and back out to the truck, getting her in and buckled before going around and getting in a drive. She was still coughing, but only a little now, and she hadn't said anything else. When I asked her if she was okay, she just nodded without looking up at me, and decided it was better to get away and then ask her more questions after we were somewhere safe. So I drove us back into town. I thought about going to my house or hers, but I didn't want to wait that long to check on her again. Pulling into a well-lit gas station, I parked in front of the store and looked over at her. "Are you okay?" She sat silent for a few moments before turning back to me. "I don't think so." Her voice sounded hoarse, and her eyes were wet, though I wasn't sure if it was tears or just from coughing so hard. "Do you think you're sick? Like you're having an allergic reaction to something?" Reaching up to scratch the back of her neck, she shook her head. "No, it's not like that. I saw that thing coming toward us." I nodded, reaching out to touch her arm.
I know. I couldn't see it or find it maybe. I don't know. It was all so fast. What was it? Still rubbing her neck, she shrugged. I don't know. It was like a shadow or like a dust cloud, except it was moving itself, and it had a shape that kept changing, like it was a thing and not a cloud, and her lip began trembling again. It was reaching out. It touched me. Fuck. Okay, what do we do? Do you want me to take you to the hospital or something? Marcy shook her head. No, Fuck. Look at my fucking neck, okay? Something back there hurts like fuck, and I can feel something back there. She turned her head in her seat to put her back facing me as she pulled down the neck of her shirt. Do you see anything back there? Turning on the overhead light, I leaned forward and sucked in a breath. There were raised marks, lines on the back of her neck just below the hairline. Not lines, but there were fucking letters. N-I-W. Listen, try not to freak out. It'll be okay. We'll figure this out. What the fuck is it? It looks like letters. N-I-W. I don't know what it means, and the N is turned wrong, but it looks like there's letters in your skin, like raised from your skin. She was breathing fast, panicked breaths now. What the fuck? Oh, God. I don't know. We need to take you somewhere. Get help. You sure it's letters and not just a scratch or a rash? No, I mean, it really looks like letters. Either N-I-W, or if it's backwards, it could be W-I-N. She froze just then. It's backwards. Because, oh God, I can still feel it. It's writing from the inside, and I can fucking feel it. Oh, Jesus. Oh, no. We have... Marcy jerked, and I reached out to touch her, comfort her, help her in some way, though I didn't know how. But then I saw it, and my hand froze. Something inside, pressing outward, making its mark as it drew another letter into her skin while I watched. What is it? What is it writing? Everything was static to me now. I could barely think, barely hear, do anything except try my best not to jump out of the truck and run. Fuck. It's an E. It looks like a fucked up E. Do you want to go to the hospital or where? My eyes were still transfixed to her skin, bulging out as the last of the lines of the letter were drawn against her insides. This all had to be a nightmare. None of it could be real. I saw a sudden change in Marcy as she shifted back to sitting normally in the seat. Her breathing was quiet now, and when she spoke, her voice was hoarse but calm. No, I can go home. I think it's okay now. I frowned, my worry and concern pushing through my fear for the moment. Are you sure? That's not normal. Marcy shrugged. It's probably just stress. The body can do the weird things when you're really scared or stressed. If it's not gone tomorrow, I can go to the doctor then. I should have pushed harder. I knew then that I should have, but I also knew what I'd just seen, and in that moment I was so scared. I just wanted to see her home safely and run away, wake up the next day and have it all be a bad dream. So instead, I took her home and let her out. She walked away without another word, up to the well-manicured walk to her parents' front door. I almost called out to her, told her to come back, but I didn't. I was afraid, so I didn't. Instead, I went home, and for hours, I sat alone in my old bedroom with the lights on, going between wanting to text her or call her and being scared she'd call or text me instead. It was nearly sunrise when I finally fell asleep, and a couple of hours later I woke up to my mother on the phone, talking loudly and starting to cry. After I left her, Marcy had went inside her house. When the mailman came by the next morning, he saw the front door was open and what looked like bloody footprints leading out of the house and into the world. He called the cops. When they went inside, they found what she had done. Her parents were in the living room. Her little brother was up in his bed. All three ripped open and hollowed out like you might field dress a deer. Outside of those bloody footprints, they never found a trace of her again. And they talked to me about it, of course. And they talked to everybody. For my part, I told the part they'd believe, that we'd gone out riding around and then I dropped her back off at home. She hadn't said anything about hurting anybody, and I hadn't known she was going to do what she did. All of that was true. I didn't tell them about the abandoned house we stopped at or the thing that had lived inside. About what happened to my best friend. About how I abandoned her once I truly understood. Because Marcy had been partially right. The letters were backwards to me because it was writing from the inside, but it wasn't writing nonsense, and it wasn't writing when or wine. It was giving me a warning. A warning that, like everything else, was upside down.
For as long as I can remember, I've seen ghosts. Okay, well, that's not entirely true, but I do have vivid hallucinations practically every night. My logical mind completely understands that the objects and creatures I see are just a manifestation of my weary mind having just awakened from a dream state. But my younger years found me terrified of things I saw in the night. I've had chronic insomnia since I was a child, so I take over-the-counter sleep aids nightly to be able to rest. These pills surely cause me to fall deeply into REM sleep, but medications or not, I still frequently wake up in the wee hours of the morning, and that's when I see things. I've seen everything from a 5-foot penguin dancing beside my bed to a full-on Roswell alien reaching out through a portal above my head. I remember one time I saw a man just sitting at my bedside where I lay with half his body inside the stereo that sat on a table at the side of my bed. By this point, I knew they were manifestations of my sleeping subconscious, so I just swatted my hand through them. It was mildly disturbing the way he just retreated backwards while staying in that hunched-over sitting position, just staring at me. Regardless of the oddness of the situation, I just rolled over and went back to sleep. I used to have crazy reoccurring dreams, too. I'm not sure if they influenced my hallucinations or not, but they were equally as strange and disturbing as some of the more unsettling images. Sure, I had plenty of falling to my death dreams or flying above the rest of the world at rest, but completely unrelated dreams would have the occasional guest star. He was like that sitcom cameo character that would always enter to the wild applause of the live audience, but not as remotely as friendly and inviting. He looked like he wore a loose skin suit that was 5 sizes too large. It just drooped and sagged from his limbs as he shuffled toward me. He reminded me, in a way, of the guy who crashed the van into a toxic waste in RoboCop back in the day. It's possible that very movie influenced his visits into my sleeping mind, effectively transforming an innocent dream into a nightmare that I would jerk awake from. I remember one of them quite vividly. I was just walking in my car as the sun was setting, and I saw him, standing a ways up the road. Though many dreams withheld memories of other nights' activities, I recognized him as soon as I noticed him off in the distance. I ran to my car while he shuffled slowly toward me, and I locked the door as soon as I got in. He was still far off when I entered my vehicle, but as soon as I locked the door, he was right outside my window. He hammered his fleshy hand into the window, leaving slick trails of sweat or slime of some sort.
With every pound of his loose skin, he would say, "Sleeper," in a voice that almost sounded like Boris Karloff's Frankenstein. I woke in a cold sweat and still saw the image of the man in his wrinkled skin suit clouded in the darkness of my bedroom, though I could no longer hear his impetuous voice. Rapituous. I woke in a cold sweat and still saw the image of the man in his wrinkled skin suit clouded in the darkness of my bedroom, though I could no longer hear his repetitious voice. His visits in my dreams would always make it hard to get back to sleep, but it's been some time since the last time I saw him. I actually hope that revisiting his memory will not set the seeds in my mind to bring a return visit tonight. Regardless of the unnerving imagery I've seen, both in my sleep and out of it, nothing has ever disturbed me more than what my half-asleep eyes showed me a few years back. All things considered, he wasn't nearly as disturbing as many of my other hallucinations, but there was just something about him that left a stain on me. Not to mention the fact that his visits became somewhat regular. Rarely do I see the same visitors more than once, aside from my saggy-skinned friend, but even he wouldn't show up as frequently. The new guy, for lack of a better term, almost resembled some sort of human-sized puppet, without the side of cute and cuddly. He wore a green one-piece pajama set that appeared patterned to look like a frog. He never had the hood pulled up over his head, but I imagined it to have big circular eyes that would rest on his forehead if he did. His face was smooth and felt-like, and his closed mouth spread across his face in a wide smile that almost touched his small, half-circle ears that stuck straight up out the side of his head, sort of like how a Muppet's mouth appears. The way that, were it to open, it would just flap the top half of his head backward. He had a little upturned bump for a nose, with wide nostrils that seemed hollowed out in the fabric of his face. His eyes were just two small dark holes with no eyebrows above them, and his short forehead cut back right above where his eyebrows would be, with no hair on top. Normally, my nightmare hallucinations appeared clouded in the same darkness the rest of my bedroom holds. This one, however, had its own subtle glow that made him stand out much more vividly. The first time he showed up, I actually found him sort of cute, compared to some of my wilder, imaginary late-night friends. He just stood in the far corner of my bedroom, performing a playful dance. He appeared something more inspired by a kid's show, though it had been many years since I indulged in such programs. I watched with wide and curious eyes as he silently bounced almost clumsily. I rarely knew where the manifestations of my dream state drew their inspirations from, but some could truly be quite bizarre. Some days would pass before his second visit, and I had plenty of other oddballs inhabiting my late-night wake calls until then. There was a row of cartoon-like hamsters scrolling across my curtain rod. A 4-foot hairless gremlin walked upright on my ceiling. He hung upside down to my view as he made his leisurely stroll. I even saw a comically ridiculous witch brewing something that formed a fine mist in her cauldron. When the 6-foot puppet reappeared on the 4th night after our first meeting, he was closer than he was before. He now stood in the dead center of my room, and his dance seemed to emit far less hilarity than it had before. He now swayed side to side, allowing his arms to hang like wet noodles from his shoulders. Though he had no more than small dark holes for eyes, I could feel them stare deeply into mine while he moved eerily from left to right. His head appeared almost detached as it stayed completely still while the rest of his body wobbled. I felt a discomfort that I had not known since the earliest occurrences of my twilight visions. I turned my back to the felt-skinned figment and tried my best to ignore his presence. I still felt his cavernous eyes glaring into the back of my head while I struggled to get back to sleep. At some point, I must have managed to regain my grip on my slumber, as I did not wake to my intended alarm some hours before I jerked back to reality. I felt dazed,
as I often would when I had not achieved as much rest as my body had requested. I called my job to attempt to explain my tardiness, and my supervisor recommended that I just take the rest of the day off and we'll chalk it up to a sick day. He was a good guy overall. He's one of those rare manager types that actually seems to care for his employees. Some of my bosses at previous jobs would likely have called me a no-call, no-show and happily given me a boot. I can't say I was upset about the surprise day off, especially right before the weekend, but I thought it would be best if I sought out a new sleep aid. Perhaps my body was becoming immune to the one I'd used for the better part of a decade. I returned to my house some 4 hours after heading out to find a new sleeping agent. I checked a couple of local pharmacies to get a variety of opinions on the subject. The first recommended a simple melatonin, which I almost immediately ignored as I'd tried them before and they had little effect on me. The next suggested a liquid form of the gel caps I'd already used, which I was unsure about. Surely the same medication would have little difference regardless of the intake method. I did purchase a bottle anyway. If nothing else, maybe it would kick in faster than having to wait for the pill's disintegration while they bobbed around in my stomach acid. I even grabbed a bigger bottle of my normal method with the intention of simply upping the dosage if chugging them made no difference. I walked the aisles of a few other stores, more aimlessly wandering than anything else. I wasn't actively seeking anything in particular. I just felt the urge to kill a little time before heading back home. I hit up a local liquor store on my drive back to see if perhaps a little tequila would assist my pursuit of a full night's rest. If not, the 12-pack of Hennies may nudge it in the right direction. I got back to my house, threw on some Friday night TV after calling in my pizza order. Not the most exciting way to spend my unexpected free day, but the rough sleep of the night before still left me feeling quite groggy and highly unmotivated. Around an hour later, my fresh and deliciously scented Supreme Pizza arrived. I paused the horror anthology movie that had secured my interest before I answered the door to receive my tasty award. Perhaps the series of twisted tales of terror I continued to watch after I sat back down to enjoy my meal was not the best choice for one who sought an insomnia-free sleeping experience. Regardless, I was a fan of the genre and had rarely had nightmares inspired by the viewing of such things, even as a child. It's not that I've never been chased around an abandoned summer camp by an axe-wielding, hockey-masked zombie in the occasional dream. I just didn't particularly see them as nightmares. It could be that my sleeping mind knew that these were merely fabrications of my subconscious and saw no reason to jerk myself back to the land of the living on account of them. Once my meal was finished and settling down in my stomach, I felt my eyes becoming heavy. It was only 10 o'clock on this eventless Friday night, but my body was still drained from the night before. I took a deep swig of my new sleep-induced concoction, and I finished the third and final beer of the night. Though I knew I would have no trouble falling asleep even without the meds, I was well aware that if I neglected to take them, I would likely be awake again within a few hours. I cut the TV off, sending the anthology of screams to rest for the night as I raised from my couch to follow suit. "Well, hello there," a high-pitched voice called through the night, forcing my dormant eyes to spring open. The puppet man in the frog onesie was staring directly at my face when I awoke. He was crouched on the floor right beside my bed, with his head at a slight tilt. "I didn't even see you there," he exclaimed. His voice sounded familiar to that of a famous Disney mouse, if he had been a pack-a-day smoker for 40 years anyway. It was high-pitched but scratchy. "Do you want to be friends?" he asked as his head flopped to the other side of the tilt. His mouth, sure enough, flapped around the top of his head like a muppet. I could even see what looked like the impression of the puppeteer's fingers pressed under the felt on the top side of the mouth. I felt stunned and somewhat perplexed by the inclusion of speaking with my new Twilight visitor. I've seen some crazy shit in the wee hours of the morning, but they never uttered sound before. Even the alien that reached through the swirling vortex above my bed did so with the slightest hint of anything audible. I'd already become a bit freaked out by the movements of his most recent creation of my weary mind, but now I was growing downright scared.
"Well," his squeal of a voice continued, "what do you say?"
I rolled over and attempted to force my eyes shut again. The most interaction I'd ever given these hallucinations was a sleepy swat through the air. I considered doing the same with the one that now crouched at my bedside, but I didn't want to encourage whatever was causing my hallucinations to, evolve. They'd never spoken before. What's next?
"Okay, sleepyhead,"
the voice echoed behind my head.
"I'll leave you alone. Sweet dreams."
He finished with a high-pitched laugh before he tousled my hair with his four-fingered mitt for a hand. With that, I jerked around and leapt from my bed. I turned the light on to be greeted with nothing more foul than my dirty clothes-laden laundry hamper. "What the fuck?" I said out loud while gasping for breath. My hands were shaking and my back was tensed up so much it felt like an iron rod. I proceeded to lift up my sheets and check under my bed, and swung the closet door open before leafing through the clothes that hung inside, in search of any sign of a late-night intruder. I headed out of my bedroom and back downstairs to perch upon my couch. No way I would be sleeping in my bed for the remainder of my night. My thoughts reeled from the figment making physical contact with me, but the rational side of my brain was already hard at work trying to ease my panic. Had to be something else that just gave me the impression of touch, right? Maybe the pillow was more fluffed on the upper side of the section I laid my head on. I may have just inadvertently brushed against it while adjusting my posture. That is far more likely than a felt-handed creature of the night rubbing my noggin. After cleaning off a few more beers, I decided to sleep off the strange events my tired mind produced. Refusing to re-enter my bedroom for the remainder of the night, I grabbed one of my coats from the rack to the side of my front door. I wrapped it around myself and curled up on the couch, leaving the lights on like a nervous child with night terrors. Sure, I wasn't actually proud of the way I was acting in the moment, but the rational portion of my brain had convinced me of the innocent misunderstanding of things as much as I would have liked to. After a good hour of tossing and turning, I finally felt myself doze off for the second time that night. I slept in again, but Saturday did not require me to awaken at a specific time, so no harm done there. I felt far more rested than I did the previous day, so I thought I may actually try to accomplish something with my responsibility-free weekend. I heard and felt my bones creak and crack while I stretched my arms out, accompanied by a long and heavy yawn. On the way to the bathroom to begin the day with a refreshing shower, I peeked in through my bedroom door. Nothing was out of place, and no strange visitors crouched on the floor beside my queen-sized bed. Feeling my sanity adjusting back to its default settings, I continued my quest for showery goodness. I was never a particularly vain individual, but the litter of hair that I watched circle down the drain as I turned off the flow of water to the shower made my heart sink quite a bit. My father had experienced early baldness, and I'd never known him to have much hair aside from the evidence shown in photographs from his youth. I suppose that it was bound to happen eventually as I ran my fingers through my hair in the bathroom mirror. I hadn't really noticed the onset of baldness before that day, but I was rarely prone to pay much attention to my own reflection. I was never a fan of the idea of being that guy with the wrap around the back hairline, so with a heavy sigh, I dug my hair clippers out of the drawer to my left and buzzed the remaining dark hair away. I couldn't have predicted that I'd be rocking the head stubble and hat at the tender age of 23, but at least it was a more commonplace look in the current times. I always had a naturally dark complexion and fairly thick eyebrows, so it wasn't as bad as I expected. I made my way out of the home while placing some phone calls to meet up with some friends that I hadn't seen in a few months. Truthfully, I just wanted to spend some time with some actual physical people while maybe getting an idea of how ridiculous I looked now. Matt and Quincy, who I'd been tight with since high school,
wasted no time in mocking my new appearance. Sure, they were apt to make fun of anything that struck their fancy on a regular basis, but they assured me it was all in good fun. We spent the rest of the day catching up and reflecting on the times gone by. We were always pretty tight, and they were among the few that I told about my strange hallucinations in the night. Since they were already familiar with these things, I decided to tell them about my more recent, unusual visitations. Quincy had taken some online psychology courses, so he advised that I may be dealing with manifestations of some childhood trauma, or something of that nature. Maddie just indicated that I may just be a full-on cuckoo bird and that I should stop watching stupid movies before bed. I actually took more offense to him calling horror movies stupid than him insinuating I was batshit. It's not like we hadn't called each other far worse things over the years. I can't say I had any recollection of childhood traumas, but Quincy said that's the nature of repression and manifestation. Maddie just laughed and offered, "Dude, you've been taking those classes for what, a year now? You really think that you're ready to be giving any goddamn diagnosis?" Quincy simply replied, "Hey, he asked for our opinions, right?" As the hours grew closer to midnight, my friends and I said our goodbyes and made our separate ways. It was good to see the two of them again. Though it had only been months since our last meeting, it seemed so much longer. Quincy's words had caused me to ponder my personal history a bit, and I planned to take a drive to my parents' house the following day. Perhaps they could shine some light on anything in my past that could have led to the strange occurrences that interrupted my sleep as of late. By the time I reached my home, I was feeling quite exhausted and ready to attempt another night's rest. I chugged my bottle of liquid slumber medication after snapping the deadbolt of my front door shut. I briefly considered climbing into my bed, but opted for snatching my blanket and pillows to carry them down to my couch. It was completely irrational. I knew that, but I had not experienced any reemergence of the felt-faced puppet man after retiring to the comfort of my sofa. Could this particular hallucination be unable to traverse a small staircase? Unlikely, but sleeping downstairs provided the best sleep I had in some time. Best to stick with what works, so I curled up under the safety of my thick blankets and let my eyes fall shut. "What you doing all the way down here?" The high-pitched tones cried out, causing another full night of rest to slip out of grasp again. He sat with his legs folded across each other on the center of my coffee table in front of the couch. He was twiddling his thick, cushioned thumbs while his little dark holes glared at me from the head that hung to the side. I had left the lights on when I passed out earlier, I knew that much, but the room lay dark now. The only light was provided by the tall street lamps outside that shed their glow through my thin curtains. He still sported his own subtle illumination, but there was something slightly different about his appearance now. I sat straight up, which brought us to gaze at each other truly face to face for the first time. I could barely convince my lungs to expand and contract while I looked into the fabric facsimile of a face. Though his mouth was just a Pac-Man-like connection of two halves of an ovular circle, it seemed to form an unsettling smile. His shoulders jumped as he let out a single giggle while we shared our staring contest. "Come on, buddy," he squeaked. "Don't you want to talk to me?" he said, spreading his arms out as if to introduce himself. I slowly shook my head side to side in response to his question, though I did not take my eyes off his deep, dark cutouts. "Okay, fine then," he said, straightening his back and folding his arms. He turned his head to the side and jutted it upwards like a pouting child. It was then that I noticed what was different about his appearance. Thick, dark hair now sprouted from his previously bald felt scalp. It almost formed a mohawk that protruded from the tip of his short head and traveled back to where his neck met the frog-eyed hood. I rubbed my now stubbled head while not allowing the thoughts that echoed from the recesses of my mind and to take full form. He turned back to me and leaned in toward me. He propped his elbows on top of his knees and leaned his soft lower jaw upon his mitts. "Why don't you want to be friends?" he asked, with the fabric above his eye holes forming a light frown.
He gave a heavy sigh that sent a foul stench of mothballed and decayed old clothing into my face. I almost gagged before he leaned in closer and bounced an outstretched plush finger off my nose with a boop, which he followed with a giggle. I don't remember going back to sleep that night, but I awoke on my sofa a little after noon. I felt a little drained, but no more than some of my uninterrupted slumbers in the past. Perhaps I had just dreamed this particular appearance of my fuzzy-faced visitor. He'd been preying heavily on my thoughts these past few days. After investigating the wide wooden table from across the couch, I found nothing out of place. The empty beer can from the night before still sat on the stained circular coaster. The box of tissues that I'd purchased earlier in the year to combat my seasonal allergies still lay in the center of the table. Shrugging this event off as a product of my overactive imagination, I started to trek up the stairs for my daily shower. I called my mom to be sure that she and my dad would be at the house before I started out on the 45-minute drive to reach my childhood home. She sounded quite giddy at the news of my visit, which caused me a flash of guilt as it had been far too long since I'd seen them in person. There had been plenty of phone calls, text messages, and emails, but I never seemed to find the time to share their company. They were loving and attentive parents, but they respected the space that a young adult required after moving out of the home they grew up in. Still, I really should try to spend more time with them. As soon as I stepped through the door, my mother wrapped her arms around me. My father just clapped me on the shoulder with his outstretched arm and greeted me with a sincere, "It's good to see you, kiddo." Once upon a time, I would have scowled at my dad for referring to me as a kid, but I couldn't help but become immersed in the nostalgia of being back here after too much time away. My mom quickly let me go to scamper into the kitchen to attend to the cookies she'd started baking after my call. This caught me off guard at first, as I used to bask in the scent of my mother's baking as a child. I hadn't noticed any sort of appetizing smell when I entered the house my folks had owned for years before I came along. Moments after my mom had fled to the kitchen, she came strolling back in, sporting twin oven mitts and a steaming tray of chocolate chip cookies. She would never lower herself to using the canned dough to prepare such a treat. She mixed them by hand, and they tasted so much more delightful than any pre-packaged snack you could find at your local grocery store. Though I still couldn't so much as pick up a whiff of the tasty goodness the now cooling stove had produced, my mouth watered in anticipation. "They're still really hot," my mom said proudly as she set the tray down on the padded prop in the middle of their large dining table. She playfully smacked my hand when I extended my arm toward the steaming pan, risking certain burnt flesh in my desire to taste the delicious treat. I gave in and agreed to allow the snacks to reach a tolerable temperature before lunging at them a second time. We began the obligatory conversation to catch up on each other's lives since our last meeting. It really had been some time since we last talked like this. My mom told me about her artistic ventures while my dad bitched about his job. He would be retiring next year, and it sounded like he was more than ready. My mother hadn't worked since she fought off cancer some years back, but she came out the other side of that battle with the urge to paint again. She'd always talked about how she loved to do such things when she was younger, but life took priority over her dreams. My father's job paid well enough to make life easy for them, though he despised it with a fiery passion. "Okay, go ahead," my mom said, giggling as she noticed me eyeballing the tray again. I instantly crammed the entirety of a wide and soft cookie into my mouth. Both my parents laughed at my enthusiasm, but when my mom asked, "So are they good as you remember?" I couldn't give her an answer. As delectable as I knew my mother's baking to be, I could not even slightly taste it. I wasn't about to tell the woman who wore a proud smile across her face that I could not reap the benefits of her craft at the moment. I just gave her a wide grin, revealing chunks of crumpled cookie bits still in my teeth, and nodded. I decided to chalk my absent taste buds as some sort of sinus issue. It was September after all, and I would often have similar allergy symptoms to those I dealt with in the spring that time of the year. My less rational section of brain was insisting I reconsider my stance on this. First, he rubbed your head and your hair fell out. Could you be the victim of a ravenous nasal boop now? The little voice in my head questioned. I would not allow myself to entertain any such ideas at this time. I chose to silence the nagging in the back of my head and simply enjoy the company of my loving parents for a time. As I predicted, my folks couldn't shed any light on potentially traumatic events from my youth, but I was pretty certain of the fact before heading out there that day. They did mention that I had an almost unhealthy obsession with my little stuffed frog, Bernie. Apparently, I built this toy up in my immature mind as an imaginary friend. We didn't live around many other families at the time, so I would dive into a fantastical world of my own with Bernie at my side. We fought pirates and evil knights with sinister agendas and even traveled the stars in a cardboard spaceship from time to time. That was until we had an apparent falling out. My mother threw open the door to my room while I was in the middle of pitching a legendary fit while tearing my beloved stuffed frog to shreds. I claimed that he turned bad and wanted to steal my life away from me while my mom grappled to hold me still. Somehow, in my rage, I'd managed to carve several small gashes into my face and forearms, presumably from my fingernails. She wrapped her arms around me in an attempt to prevent me from causing myself more harm. I had no memory of the small plush animal that she showed me in our family photo albums, nor the shredding of it. I recognized my bedroom and my other toys that the pictures reflected, but I had no recollection of Bernie and his big, bulging eyes. As the hour grew late, I bid my folks good night and began my journey home. I promised them I would not wait so long before coming out to see them again, and I meant every word. The day's revelations had unsettled me, but I truly did enjoy sharing my parents' company again. On my ride home, with little to occupy my mind outside the radio, I found my thoughts wandering away from the road ahead. It wasn't until I heard the blazing horn from headlights that were speeding toward me that I snapped out of my pensive daze. I jerked the steering wheel to the right in an effort to get back into the lane I was meant to be in. I heard the other car screaming from beside me as my overcorrection left me careening toward the trees that paralleled the road. I pulled the wheel in the opposite direction, but still slammed sideways into a thick and hefty tree. The violent collision caused my head to smash into my side window, cracking the glass and rendering me unconscious.
Ow!
The high-pitched voice said, awakening me from my unconscious state.
That looks like it hurts bad,
he continued, as he reached his soft mitt across the compacted passenger seat. He used a padded thumb to wipe blood from my left eye. I had no idea the extent of my injuries, but I could feel the dried blood crack when I made a wincing expression due to the pounding of my head. I adjusted my posture back to an upright position and turned to face the 6-foot puppet who currently rode shotgun in my steaming car. Since most of the damage was on the passenger side, it appeared that I only suffered wounds inflicted by the impact itself, though my left foot had somehow jammed under the brake pedal. I tugged at it with my hands wrapped around my upper thigh, but I couldn't get it free until,
"I'll help you, old buddy, old pal,"
came from the felt-faced man who sat next to me, before he contorted his soft body sideways to grip my leg with his felt-lined fingers. He made exaggerated grunting sounds while he wiggled my foot back and forth, ultimately freeing it from beneath the pedal. I found myself a little surprised and somewhat intimidated by the strength those cushioned, plushed hands showed. "Thank you," I replied, still in a degree of shock, but sincerely grateful to the strange man in the frog onesie.
"Thank you."
My jaw fell agape when his squeaky voice morphed into mine. It wasn't until that moment that I noticed the new addition to his face. A fleshy human nose now took the place of a small nub with the hollow nostrils that had previously sat just below his beady eye holes. "See you later, buddy," He spoke through my own words before my eyes closed again. When I awoke on a hospital bed, I felt confused and lost for a moment. Over the hours that followed, the doctor informed me of my injuries, which included a deep gash across my eyebrow, a slight contusion, and an unexplainable series of bruising on my left leg. I investigated my shin to see darkened flesh in the pattern of a four-fingered hand. I stayed overnight at the doctor's recommendation and would find more troubling revelations the following day. After the bandages were removed, I still could not see anything out of my left eye. On top of that, I found myself unable to move my left leg from the knee down. They ran several tests to check for nerve damage and the like, but could come to no positive conclusion as to why my limb hung limp and lifeless. As the day progressed, my voice grew scratchy, and I would find myself coughing whenever I attempted to speak. Again, no answers could be found to account for this ailment either. I could no longer ignore the reality of what was happening to me, though I could not convince anyone to believe my story. Over the weeks that followed, I started seeing a psychiatrist and endured a number of pointless sleep studies. The shrink prescribed me a variety of medications, and he seemed convinced my issues were psychosomatic. As weeks led to months, I still hadn't regained my sense of smell or the sight in my left eye. I continued to walk with a limp with the aid of a cane, which was another recommendation from my doctor. I can still speak, but only for so long at a time before I start coughing as my throat goes more scratchy with every word uttered. It'd be close to a year before I had another meeting with the felt-faced puppet man. It's been a while, huh? My voice uttered from beside my bed, causing the night's sleep to come to an end. I turned to face him before adjusting myself into a sitting position in my bed. He still had his unnatural glow, but he now had human lips to go with the nose he had stolen before. I noticed the left leg of his onesie was now cut short below his knee to reveal a fleshy shin and foot. His hair was longer now, almost hanging to his shoulder, and his left eye hole had been replaced by a light blue, human-like eye. It didn't surprise me to see these new aspects to his appearance, as I had no misconceptions about what had truly caused the ailments I still suffered from. "What do you want now, Bernie?" I asked with a heavy sigh. "Just one last thing," he said with a wide smile spreading across his fleshy mouth. He even had a row of sparkling white teeth behind them. At least he wouldn't have to steal mine. "Go on, then," I replied, growing impatient at the knowledge I was about to become even more disabled than I was before I laid down that night. He clumsily walked toward the bed and reached a hand out to my right ear. He rubbed his felt hand across it before whipping a tarnished silver coin from behind it. He held it out in front of me before dropping it onto the bed. "For all the trouble," he said as I felt the hearing fade from where he had brushed. A comically loud popping sound erupted from the side of his head as a fleshy ear appeared in place of the previous half-circle of felt. I picked up the coin he'd bounced onto my bed. I looked at it to see that it didn't look like any currency I was familiar with. I turned my gaze back to the strange mix of puppetry and human parts before me with my head tilted. "I figure it's the least I can do, after all you've done for me," he replied with a chuckle that sounded like a bizarre combination of his previously high-pitched laugh and my own. "So, is this the last time?" I asked, dreading the answer. He placed the stuffed forefinger to his mouth and turned his stolen eye up at the ceiling. "Might just be," he replied, still glaring upward. He turned his head back to me and held his left arm straight out in front of him with his fingers outstretched. "Let's shake on it," he said, smiling even wider than before. "You said one last thing. You already took my fucking ear." I exclaimed, both frustrated and angry. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, frozen in place with that creepy grin. Fuck it, I said with a heavy sigh. At least I'm a righty, I concluded, grasping his soft hand in mine, fully expecting this to be the last time I'd be able to use those fingers. With another comically loud pop, he disappeared right before my eyes. I'd never actually seen him leave before, so maybe this was actually the last time. It's been 2 years since that night, and I still have the use of both my hands. Sure, the left one has a tendency to lock up at times, and it grows steadily more painful the more I use it, but I can't complain. I still only have one good eye, one good ear, no sense of smell, but things could be worse. The gift my fleshed and felted visitor left me with turned out to be a flowing hair, silver copper dollar that I sold at auction for around $7.5 million, after taxes, of course. This allowed me to enjoy ample comforts to distract me from my disabilities, so I can't say it was a complete waste. I even had my useless leg removed and replaced with a prosthetic that is far more easy to work with than a limp chunk of flesh and bone that just dangled there before. I never got answers to who that puppet man really was, or how he was able to steal from me what he did. Could he really be a product of my childhood mind who somehow found himself tangible and sentient? I highly doubt it. There's lots of crazy shit out there, as my granddad used to say. There's no telling if I'll ever see Bernie again, or if he'll feel the need to rob me of any more senses if he should. I still sleep with the light on, and I still battle with insomnia, but perhaps my nightmare has actually ended. I still awaken to the sound of high-pitched, eerie laughter from time to time, but that just may be my mind playing tricks. Just beware of the shadows that play across your walls in the wee hours of the morning. You never know if there's something real hiding amongst them.